All right, fuck it. We're doing it live. We're doing it live. I'm as ready as I'm going to be. I'm definitely as ready as I'm going to be. Let's see if I can work my magic with some new skills learned in OBS and all these other wonderful software programs that YouTubers get to use. Good evening, everyone. And today we're going to have a watch-along of the 1968 United States presidential election between Richard Nixon, the Republican from, well, actually in this election he technically was from New York, even though he's originally from California. Kind of odd. And then Humphrey, who was vice president under Lyndon B. Johnson. He is originally from Minnesota and was a senator there before he became vice president once Lyndon Johnson became president. Let me adjust a few settings here real quick. Turn the music down just a little bit. I love patriotic music as much as the next red-blooded American, but I can't hear myself that well over this music, and I know y'all can't hear me that well. So anyway, this is basically going to be the second of several, I guess what you would call election night watch-alongs from years past that we're going to do. Once again, just like I did with 1960 a few days ago, we're going to watch NBC's coverage because I simply like their anchors and directing style just a little bit more than what was available from ABC and CBS at the time. No offense to any of the people who were working there, most of whom, unfortunately, I guess are dead. You know, it's been almost 60 years since this election, so... But we're going to watch NBC's coverage, and NBC did like hours and hours of coverage that started in the early afternoon on that November day of 1968. But we're going to watch the first bit, and then I guess I'm probably going to skip ahead to some of the later coverage. Once a lot of states get called and the map starts getting filled and we're down to the last few states about, you know, who is going to win. A little bit of background about this election. I mentioned in my 1960 stream that that was the very first, I guess what you would call modern media election among United States presidential elections, because it was the first year that a majority of households in the United States owned television sets. And everything that you saw from the election coverage and election night coverage from that election pretty much carries on to what is present day over the last few elections. And you can kind of see the common thread going here. 1968 being the third presidential election since the whole thing started with, you know, live wall-to-wall coverage in 1960 was another kind of close election, but it was close in a different way. As we'll see toward the end when I pull up the electoral vote map, or if you want to cheat and look it up on 270 to Win or any of those other sites, 1968 is kind of a interesting, somewhat tumultuous year in American political history. The 1950s and 1960s had the civil rights movement, and it culminated in a lot of legislation being signed during LBJ's presidency in 1964 and I think 1965. There were bits and pieces of legislation that were civil rights related that were signed 66, 67, 68. But the 1960s beyond that represented kind of a, you know, when you talk to Americans about what happened in the 1960s, the beginning of the decade looks almost nothing like the end of the decade. And, you know, there was like the whole whole love culture and counterculture and everything that's associated with that. And the other big political issue in the whole background there was the Vietnam War. Tens of thousands of American, you know, men were getting killed. And the war was very unpopular within the United States among, I would say, probably a majority of the American voting public. And they wanted to come, you know, wanted some kind of end to the war with either winning or not losing too badly, I guess. And the war kind of sank LBJ's popularity. In 1968, the reason it was politically tumultuous was Twofold. Number one, there were two major political, well, actually, I think three major political assassinations that took place that year. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, I think in April of that year. And then Robert F. Kennedy, who was likely to be the Democratic nominee that year for president, that's the current RFK Jr.'s dad, RFK Jr. being the Health and Human Services Secretary under Trump. His dad was probably going to be the Democratic nominee, but he was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles that year as well, before, I guess some of the primaries may have gotten underway, but I don't remember the exact order of events. And I want to say, and I mean, if I'm totally wrong on the date on this and the year, somebody please correct me, but Malcolm X was also assassinated that year. So you had two major civil rights leaders as well as a likely candidate for president being assassinated in such a short time frame. And this was, keep in mind, this was less than 5 years after the assassination of President Kennedy in November of 1963. And so the 60s was just a very tumultuous decade politically for America. Yes, there was quite a lot of landmark legislation that was signed. That was the March on Washington, where Dr. King spoke in front of the Lincoln Memorial. There was a lot going on with the Vietnam War. And during this whole time, the Apollo space program was getting underway, and the United States would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade in 1969. So lots of stuff happening this decade. And this election kind of reflects a lot of what was going on in America politically. There was a sense that there needed to be some kind of change, but also some kind of order after a lot of what was going on with anti-war protests and civil unrest in the mid to late 60s. And so that when law and order became kind of a major theme in this election, along with obviously the economy, the Cold War versus the US versus the Soviet Union, as well as, you know, the Vietnam War. And those were the major issues of the day of this election. And so there were actually three major candidates for president. Richard Nixon was the Republican candidate. Hubert Humphrey, who is to my left here and to your right, was the Democratic candidate for president, who wound up getting the Democratic nomination after a kind of big party, quote unquote, at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago of that year, which kind of splintered the party into two and helped contribute to some of the result, which I'm not going to spoil for you, but obviously you can look it up. But Richard Nixon ran again after he lost to Kennedy in 1960. He's pictured to my right, your left. He was the 37th president of the United States. He was vice president under Eisenhower. So after he lost the presidential election in 1960, he kind of went a little bit into the political wilderness. He did run for governor of California in 1962 and lost, I believe, to Pat Brown, who was recent governor Jerry Brown's father. Jerry Brown was governor of California throughout much of the late 70s and early 80s, and he also was governor of California throughout most of the 2010s. He was both the youngest and oldest governor of California, oddly enough. Interesting tidbit, and served the longest, 16 total years, four terms. But I'm not going to dive too much into like California political history, even though one of the major candidates that you see on the screen got his political start in California, is from California. So, but without much further ado, I'm trying to think if I covered all the bases as far as like laying out the general knowledge of what this election was about before we begin the coverage. Oh yeah, the third political party candidate was Alabama Governor George Wallace. He led the what was called the American Independence Party, who were kind of against civil rights, and he was a pro-segregationist governor in the South at the time, and was a Dixiecrat. And the Dixiecrats were still around, probably like, you know, they lasted for quite a few election cycles even after this, but they reached their peak in the 50s and 60s. And George Wallace running under the American Independence Party ticket was kind of their biggest gasp of air, I guess, for the American political scene. This was the last election where a third party won states and won electoral votes. And so because of that electoral dynamic, George Wallace wound up winning 5 states, mostly in the Deep South. It made it highly likely going into election night that there was a reasonable chance that this would be the only election besides 1824 that would have been thrown into the House of Representatives. If you're not familiar with the way presidential election works and how it's spelled out in the United States Constitution, they quip about this every once in a while, every 4 years. What happens if there's a 269 tie? Well, if nobody gets 270 votes, if nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives picks among the top 3 electoral vote getters when the Electoral College votes. They pick the president among the top 3. And the way they do that is they vote by state delegation. And so whoever wins the most state delegations in the United States House of Representatives would become president. And by state delegation, what that means is that Wyoming, which is only worth 3 electoral votes and has only 1 U.S. House Representatives, gets 1 vote for president. And California, with its, I believe, 52 U.S. House Representatives now, because I think it's worth 54 electoral votes, that lost one last election, that last census cycle, they also collectively get 1 vote. So whoever wins the most state delegations in the U.S. House gets elected president. And that's just a situation, kind of a constitutional crisis that is best avoidable, because if you look into history of what happened in 1824, well, it's not pretty. Andrew Jackson was kind of screwed, and he called it a corrupt bargain. And it's one of the reasons Henry Clay of Kentucky never became president. But enough about American history from me. We're going to go into this, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So let me pull up my other screen here. And here we go with NBC's election coverage. I'm planning for this stream to only last maybe 2 or 3 hours. Like I said, we're gonna watch maybe the first bit of coverage, and then we're gonna skip ahead past, you know, the middle hours of the election night coverage and go to late in the morning when there are really only 7 states that are left to be called. And that's when the dynamic starts getting interesting about whether or not we will know if somebody wins and somebody gets a majority in the Electoral College. So here we go. Let me turn down the patriotic music. And once again, this is from NBC. So here are Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, that dynamic duo that was present in 1960, 8 years later. And by the way, before I play this, most of this also will be in black and white, but NBC was the first of the major networks that was full color. And by the late 1960s, a good chunk of American households had color television sets. And so this actually originally aired in color. A lot of the footage is going to be black and white, but as we get toward the evening hours, you will see color TV footage from the late 1960s.
NBC News, Election Central in New York. Here is the news, reported by Chet Huntley and David Brinkley.
The candidates today voted early, then rested or drummed their fingers, and the people took over. And in generally good weather over most of the nation, the people were voting in unprecedented numbers. Throughout the East and in much of the Midwest, the voting rate was well ahead of what it was 4 years ago. Southern California was one exception. Reports from Los Angeles described voting there as listless and light. Both Republicans and Democrats hailed the big turnout and saw partisan advantage in it. In addition to a president and vice president, Americans today were electing 34 senators, 21 governors, all 435 members of the House, 42 state legislatures, and thousands of state and local officials. No disturbances at polling places were reported. David?
First, we're going to take a look at our big board showing the total popular vote for president. At this moment, a few states have closed some of their polls. We have about 1% of the vote in, and that is how it reads.
Before we move forward, I do want to make a correction. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965 in New York City, so I got that a little bit off. But my general point still stands. There was just a lot of political turmoil and assassinations in the 1960s in the United States.
About 45% for Nixon, 35% for Humphrey, 20% for Wallace. These mostly are in the East, obviously, and several of them in the South. Now here's some individual states, beginning with New Hampshire, where we have only a few votes, not really enough to tell anything. Less than 1%, actually, and there it is, Nixon ahead.
I love it was like,
again,
yeah,
that isn't enough
10
to
to
mean anything.
26.
Kentucky, we have 13% in Kentucky. This is one where Wallace was expected.
And as tradition, it seems like Kentucky and Indiana are always the first states to close their polls for whatever reason, and they close them relatively early. Don't know why.
To do quite well, and at one time he predicted he would carry it. We'll see before the evening is over who carries it, but that's where it stands now.
What you're going to see as the night rolls along is that all three candidates are going to get significant percentages in most of these states. And so they have all three displayed here. And so there are very few states, if any, where any one of these candidates, Nixon or Humphrey or Wallace, get a majority of the vote. They win the electoral votes of each state with a plurality. So Nixon, the states that you're going to see he wins is mostly going to be in like the 40s. He's going to get between 40 and 49%. Same with Humphrey, and I think same with Wallace. I don't know what his margins were in the states that he won. He won Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, I think, the Deep South states.
Now, with 13% in. Tennessee, Nixon ahead, Wallace second.
And I'm sorry I keep interrupting, but I'm just really nerding out about election history here. I mentioned in 1960 how there's actually kind of a cultural and political and economic difference between the upland South and the Deep South because of how reliant they were on cotton as a crop. And that's basically what determined just, how economically dependent they were on slavery a little over 100 years before this election took place. And so Tennessee is a Mid-South state. It's very mountainous. It's very hilly. So it wasn't as reliant on the plantation economy as like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi were. And that political history within the United States carries on to this day, and it carried on into this election where 1968 is one of those elections you're going to see a difference between how the Deep South states like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana vote versus the Mid-South or the Upland South states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina to some extent. Even I would argue, well, yeah, let's just leave it at those four states. But you'll see a little bit of a difference. They don't have any maps during this election night, but if you want to look it up, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And John Chancellor, I believe, is going to be the anchor here at NBC News that's going to explain or imply it a little bit about Wallace being strong in the Deep South, but his strength weakened significantly once you get to the Mid-South, where they were more attuned to what Nixon's campaign message was about law and order, rather than like repealing all the civil rights legislation that Wallace was advocating during this election. So that was a major difference between the Deep South, where Wallace did really well, and the Mid-South, where his support kind of fizzled out a little bit, and Nixon pulled ahead instead of Wallace.
In Alabama, not enough votes in yet to mean anything, but of the few we do have, as you see, Wallace is far in advance. Kansas, 3% in. Nixon first, Humphrey.
Okay, so what you see in Alabama here is Humphrey is running on 2 party tickets, and Alabama was kind of weird in this era of how they counted their votes, because you could vote straight party. I'm not quite actually sure how that worked, but it was what it was.
Kansas, 3% in. Nixon first, Humphrey second, Wallace third. Ohio, less than 1%, hardly enough to bother with, actually. That's, those are the total figures we have at this moment. We'll be back shortly with more of them. Chet?
The presidential candidates, they're campaigning over, their votes cast, waited tonight for the returns to come in. Vice President Humphrey is at a hotel in Minneapolis, Richard Nixon in his New York apartment, and George Wallace at his headquarters in Montgomery, Alabama. Senator Edmund Muskie waited in a motel in Waterville, Maine, his hometown, Spiro Agnew in Annapolis, Maryland, and Curtis LeMay joined George Wallace in Alabama. NBC News correspondents are stationed at all these locations, and they will report from them tonight.
The Huntley-Brinkley Report is produced by NBC.
That kind of threw a monkey wrench into the election, to say the least.
Were perfectly willing to show up and to permit the United States to represent both itself and South Vietnam. But the Americans called off the meeting, saying only that they're continuing to consult with South Vietnam and that they'll announce a new meeting date when one is decided. In Saigon, rallies sponsored by the government and the Catholics were held to protest American policy. The rallies were decorous and productive of nothing more than some shouting in front of the United States Embassy. There was little fighting, but Monday night the enemy fired 3 shells at the Mekong Delta city of Mai To. There were no casualties and little damage. President Thieu called the shelling a provocative act which cast doubt on the North's promise to de-escalate in return for a bombing halt. Fighting was reported again tonight outside the Jordanian city of Amman. Bands of Palestinian commandos who use Jordan as a base for guerrilla raids into Israel have been harassing units of the Jordanian army, which is under orders to destroy them. Battles between King Hussein's troops and the outlawed commandos have been bloody. In Syria, a representative of the Palestinian movement said a full-scale showdown with Hussein is inevitable and that Jordan is on the brink of civil war. Soviet dredgers docked at the north end of the Suez Canal have given rise to reports the Russians may be planning to reopen that waterway. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister of Israel, doesn't share this view. At a Tel Aviv news conference yesterday, Dayan said he doubts Egypt will permit the canal to be reopened by anyone.
The Egyptians do not want the Suez Canal to operate while we are sitting there. They are afraid that then it will turn into normal, that we are sitting along the Suez Canal and the Suez Canal is operating, which they don't like. So the way that the Egyptians take it, not us, is that the first stage is to have us withdrawing from the Suez Canal and only then to use the dredger and to clear the Suez Canal. And of course to make us withdrawing by force means war. I haven't seen any indications, and I don't think that dredgers are indications that the Russians want to push us back from the Suez Canal and to break the ceasefire agreement.
West German customs authorities at the Frankfurt airport have seized 32 crates of rocket parts being shipped from the United States to Saudi Arabia. A false manifest described the shipment as machinery. German officials said the parts could be used to build 12 to 15 military rockets. The shipment came from a Northrop Corporation division in Newbury Park, California.
Now, another look at our national total vote board. It changes every minute. Still about 1%. We have some more figures, but it still stands at 1%. And there's the result, as you see. Nixon ahead, Humphrey about 10% behind him, and Wallace hanging about 19%. Here with us tonight, and all night, if necessary, are the no doubt famous 4 of Chancellor Vanocur, Newman, and McGee. And all of them, of course, without exception, brave, thrifty, loyal, true, brilliant, and handsome. And here are all 4, one at a time, beginning with Sandy Vanocur. Sandy?
34 Senate seats are involved in today's voting. 23 are now held by Democrats, 11 by Republicans. In Kansas, where Republican Frank Carlson is vacating his Senate seat, NBC News has projected Republican Congressman Robert Dole the winner over his Democratic opponent, William L. Robinson. Our projection is based on actual votes received from the News Election Service. In Kansas, by state law, the ballot boxes can be opened during the day and the vote counted. Most polls in Kansas close at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, which is a short while from now. 2 senators are unopposed. They are Russell Long, Democrat of Louisiana, and Republican George Aiken of Vermont. He also won the Democratic nomination. In Kentucky, in the contest for the Senate seat being vacated by Republican Senator Thurston Morton, the Republican Louisville judge Marlowe Cook is leading his Democratic opponent, State Commerce Commissioner Catherine Peden, with now 24% of the vote reported. Now for a report on the House races. Here is Edwin Newman.
Now, we say that 435 House seats are to be filled tonight, all the House seats. That's true, but actually 37 Democrats and 8 Republicans have no opposition and must be returned. Some are well known. Wilbur Mills of Ways and Means, Taxes. Mendel Rivers of Armed Services. Wright Patman, Chairman of Banking and Currency. Texas has 11 coming back unopposed, Georgia 7, Massachusetts and Mississippi 4 each. Now, it's generally expected that the Democrats will hold the House. The division now is 247 Democrats, 188 Republicans. The Republicans need a net gain of 30 for outright control, and that would require a very big victory for Nixon. Incidentally, those figures you just saw, 5 Democrats elected, 15 Republicans elected, do not represent any change. However, if the Republicans should come close tonight, they might possibly try to swing over some conservative Democrats and take control that way. There's also a chance that the House will choose the next president in January if nobody gets enough electoral votes to win. Each state delegation would cast 1 vote, and the possible complications are endless, so we'd better see whether it really may happen before we begin speculating.
That was what I was referring to early. Depending on how many Wallace would get, if it would make it much harder for either Humphrey or Nixon to get 270, and it would have thrown to the House of Representatives. This is the closest it came in recent elections, I'd say within the past 100 years.
Now here's Frank McGee.
Well, there is little to comfort the Democrats as they look across the country tonight and ponder the outcome of 21 races for governor. First, there is the fact that 13 of those state houses have been under the control of the Democrats, while the Republicans are risking only 8. So the Democrats simply are more exposed this time. Second, several popular Democratic governors are not running for re-election, adding to their party's generally dismal prospects. But third, and far more important, is the general belief that Democratic candidates for governor will be punished by voters who are unhappy with President Johnson. But even at this early hour, we have a few returns from some states. First, in Kansas, where we have about 3% tabulated. The Democrat Docking is getting 52% to the Republican Harmon's 48%. Still, this represents a shift from previous patterns, and the Republicans are happy. Very light return so far from New Hampshire, where the Democrat Emil Bouchier is getting 19% to the Republican Walter Peterson's 81%, but only a total of 29 votes involved. For 10 years, since 1958, Democratic control of state houses has been on a steady decline. Going to the wire tonight, the indications are they could lose another 6, perhaps 8 governors, and that would leave them at the lowest ebb since the early 20s. Now here's John Chancellor.
Now, what you'll notice about what Frank McGee was talking about was this was an election where Republicans were just favored to gain seats in the Senate, in the House, even though they were not going to take the majority, obviously, but also among governorships and state houses. It was just that Wallace's candidacy and his ability to win several southern states kind of threw the presidential election and who might win into a little bit of question. Although a lot of the talking heads and insiders in Washington at the time, in hindsight, this has come years later, they had the feeling Nixon was going to win, including LBJ himself. He thought Nixon was going to win the election.
There is more to this election than just who won and who lost. 75 million people could cast ballots today. 75 million people who will be telling us something about ourselves. One thing we will learn tonight is the true strength and the location of the Wallace movement. We will soon know if the vote...
And John Chancellor's about to go exactly over what I was talking about, the difference between the Deep South and the Upland South. Tennessee and Kentucky are not the same as Alabama and Mississippi, trust me.
Voters regard George Wallace as a national candidate or whether they have quarantined him in the Deep South. We will know also if the politicians reached the Negroes this year and how many black people were finally interested in the American political process. We'll be able to check on that.
Yeah, 1968 was, I think, the first presidential election after the Voting Rights Act passed and started to be enforced. And so black turnout in elections started increasing significantly, starting with this presidential election. And it really matched, it matched white turnout, I think, in 2008 and in 2012 with Obama's election. And it's remained that way ever since. That's the case to this day over the past election cycles. You know, white Americans and black Americans vote. Others, you know, Asians, Hispanics, not quite as much. That may change. You never know.
That ancient alliance called the Democratic Coalition, which has kept the Democrats in power for 28 out of the last 36 years. And we may see the beginning of some new political alliances. We'll be able to gauge the effect of George Wallace's law and order speeches to blue-collar workers and Nixon's time for a change speeches to white-collar workers. We'll be able to determine the voting patterns of rich people and poor people and some minority groups, and we'll be able to check on the different regions of the country to see what their voting patterns show. All of this tonight gives us an opportunity to chart the course of change in the United States and to make some estimates about our common future. So it is a lot more than simply who won and who lost. Now back.
Everything John Chancellor said in that whole spiel applies today. It's like people think America is like so divided and all this other stuff. It's like, hello, it's been that way throughout American history, even in recent times, even in the so-called golden days of the 50s through the 80s or whatever. So I mean, like, it's the more things change, the more things stay the same.
Back to you, David.
Thank you. Now we'll look again at the reports from the few states, the several states where we have a few scattered returns, beginning with New Hampshire. That's less than 1% actually, and not enough as yet to tell anything at all, but what we do have, there it is. Kentucky, we have a more substantial portion of the vote, 26%. Nixon is ahead, Humphrey second, Wallace third. In Tennessee, 12% of it is in. Nixon is first, Wallace second, and Humphrey is third. In Alabama, which is Wallace's own state, of course, we still have less than 1%, not enough to tell much, but even with these few figures, Wallace, as you see, is well ahead with 85% of the vote. Kansas, 3% of it. This is a Nixon state, said to be, from the beginning. And so far, it appears to be 56% for him. And Ohio, we still don't have enough from Ohio to amount to anything. But they should begin to flood in rapidly now. Richard Nixon closed his campaign last night with a question and answer session on television. And he flew today from California back here to New York, where he lives. And he will tune in the election returns in a hotel suite here in New York City. And in a ballroom downstairs, they have prepared elaborately for what they believe will be a victory celebration. It includes big bags of balloons hung up on the ceiling, ready for somebody to pull the string and let them out. Nixon was asked about a last-minute poll showing Humphrey slightly ahead, and he said, "I don't consider that reliable." He has spent most of his day in an airplane that...
Where have you heard that before where have you heard that before from a Republican candidate for president?
Here are two reports on the days spent by the other candidates. From contributing editors Jack Perkins with Humphrey in Minneapolis and Douglas Kiker with Wallace in Montgomery.
The ballroom of the Leamington Hotel in Minneapolis is all draped and spangled and ready for the party. Mr. Humphrey is not here. After flying all night back from Los Angeles, he voted and now is at his home in Waverly, Minnesota. That's about an hour from here. He'll go to dinner with friends on the shores of Lake Minnetonka, and then he'll come to the hotel. And in a suite on the 14th floor, he will watch the results. As Mr. Humphrey and his aides watch the results, New York will be of particular concern. It will be one of the first early big ones. And they have felt all along that if they did not win New York, they probably could not win the election. As the momentum of this campaign has grown over the past few weeks, so has the confidence, but it should be said that they are probably more confident of a popular vote victory than an electoral vote victory. So really, they can't be sure what kind of party this is going to be tonight. Jack Perkins, NBC News, at Humphrey headquarters in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Here in Montgomery seats about 12,000 people. And about 12,000 people, all of them fervent Wallace supporters, will be here later tonight watching the election results and praying for the upset of upsets. George Wallace will be here, too, later tonight. Wallace left Montgomery this morning and rode 80 miles to his hometown of Clayton to vote. And a big group of friends and neighbors and relatives were there to greet him. After he voted, Wallace had lunch with his grandmother, then rode back here to Montgomery. And now George Wallace is waiting to see what happens. At a motel just across the street, some of his campaign workers have put 10 cases of champagne on ice, just in case. It probably won't go to waste because Wallace doesn't really need to win the election to win a personal victory. If he comes in second, if the election ends in a three-way deadlock, if he shows substantial strength outside the South. So far as Wallace is concerned, any of these things would prove his case and be a victory of sorts.
So Wallace didn't have that much strength outside of the Deep South. It kind of fizzled. He did have significant support among certain demographic groups in the northern United States. And it was basically among a lot of what you would call your white ethnics back then. Your Irish, your Italians, your Poles, white working class in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. But it really didn't amount to that much simply because Nixon just got so much, and so did Humphrey among a lot of those voters there. So it really wasn't enough to throw those states one way or the other.
Douglas Kiker, NBC News, at the Wallace LeMay headquarters in Montgomery, Alabama.
If there is a conservative trend in today's voting, it could result in pressure to reverse Supreme Court rulings on school integration. One such ruling recently held that the free choice plan, which allowed parents to send their children to any school, did not bring racial balance and was, therefore, unacceptable. The specific case involved New Kent County, Virginia. The New Kent district was ordered to integrate fully, but was given another year to prepare. Here is a report from NBC News correspondent Ron Nesson.
Even though New Kent County is only 25 miles outside Richmond, and many residents commute to nearby shipyards and factories, its outlook is rural. Of the 4,500 residents, all but 58 were born in the county. There are only 2 schools in the county. One has always been the Negro school. Under freedom of choice, white parents could have sent their children here, but none did, even though it was closer to home for some and would have saved a bus ride. The other school was all white until 1965, when the federal government threatened to cut off school aid. The school board gave ground and allowed Negro children to go to the white school if they wanted to. Some did, despite intimidation. This year, 136 Negroes attended out of 650 students. Even some Negro teachers were brought in.
We note that the Greeks gave us the idea of democracy, and that is a rule by the people.
I tried to find the unmute button for my mic for whatever reason. One of the interesting things about watching election night coverage from years past is the types of news stories that you get and what were, you know, the political, social, economic, whatever you call it, dominant headlines of the day. And, you know, this was this was at least a decade after Brown versus Board of Education, but school desegregation was a big topic back then, obviously, and so that's covered in the news here, as you can see. And you'll see some of this as we go along through election night coverage, because it's Huntley Brinkley Report and NBC News that is basically covering or using this extended coverage throughout this day back in 1968.
And it is the system of government that we have today. So thus we are not to take things for granted, because we have inherited these things such as democracy and the love of beauty has been handed down to us by the Greeks.
Freedom of choice, when used in the South to hold off full school integration, was struck down in a suit in the name of a 9-year-old boy, Charles C. Green. The courts allowed New Kent County 1 more year to make preparations. 1 year from now, all elementary grade children, black and white, will go to one school. All high school students, black and white, will go to the other school. Even Charles Green's father, who filed the suit, did not object strongly to the 1-year delay.
I feel personally about the delay in that it is going to provide us an opportunity to do a better job with total integration.
Will the Negro students be able to keep up?
In some situations, we would find that there would be necessity for special classes and special tutoring, even for the first 2 or 3 years, in order to have all of the students of a particular grade level properly integrated into a class. A number of persons feel they might not succeed in an integrated situation.
Well, doesn't this give some justification to the white side of the argument?
No, because the white side has not considered the fundamental problem of suppression that the Negro has experienced in 350 years of this country's life. And this is the background of the situation that the Negro is trying to overcome. Now,
this is a time when the price has to be paid for the past.
Yes, but the white person isn't paying it. The Negro is going to pay this price in extra work, and he's got to do more to produce in order to come up to the standards. We do not expect that the school standards will be lowered to satisfy the passing of Negro students, or white students. But the Negro, because of his background, understands that he must work harder and put forth more effort in any situation other than his own in order to achieve the same levels of success he easily achieves in his own society.
The ruling in this little rural Virginia county told the entire South that it's not enough to give black children the choice of attending white schools. The court said it will no longer accept integration based on a system of black schools and white schools. There must be simply schools. Ron Nesson, NBC News, New Kent County, Virginia.
Here is the latest count in the popular vote for president. 1% of the vote is in. Nixon leading with 44% at the moment, Humphrey with 37%, Wallace with 19%. Certainly inconclusive, but perhaps indicative of a trend. Now, state by state, in New Hampshire, 1% of the vote is inconclusive, but Nixon leading healthily. In Kentucky, 43% of the vote is in, and by projection, Nixon has won the state of Kentucky with 43% of the vote.
And this is key to what I was talking about. Kentucky was kind of like what John Chancellor would call a border state back then. And before the current, everybody thinks border state now is basically states between, that border, the Mexican border. But politically, border state back then in the 1960s and 1970s, and even into the 1980s, meant border between the northern states and the southern states within the United States. And Kentucky was considered one of those states. And so Kentucky being like a mid-South or an upland South state, Nixon did much stronger, and Wallace's support kind of fizzled out here and in Tennessee and in other states, as you'll see. And them calling Kentucky this early is kind of like evident of that dynamic.
Tennessee. 16% of the vote is in. Nixon leading with 43%, and Wallace.
And you can see here it's true with Tennessee. Wallace relatively strong, but still not as strong as Nixon. Compare this number to what you see in Alabama, and it's like night and day.
In second place, Humphrey trailing in third. Most of these returns are from the eastern part of the state. The city of Memphis, for example, has yet to be heard from. Alabama, 1% of the vote is in, entirely inconclusive, but there Wallace is leading with 81%. And in Kansas, 3% of the vote is in, Nixon leading, Humphrey in second place, entirely inconclusive. David?
Soon the figures will be pouring in here in enormous quantities, and that big tabulator you've been seeing, the one with the total national vote on it, will change automatically every 60 seconds from now until sometime tomorrow, perhaps. And by then, the total figure should be somewhere above 70 million votes. And then we will know which of the experts, odds makers, prognosticators, pollsters, and others have been right, if any. Those who have been right will accept the congratulations, and those who were wrong will make excuses. But that is the peril or the price for trying to say in advance what 75 million people will do. It's been one of the roughest, and unhappiest political years in American history. In the next few hours, or for as long as it takes, we'll see how it all turned out. Chet?
We'll return in just a few minutes to continue our election night coverage.
WSM Television, Color 4, Nashville, Tennessee.
And about 500,000 for Wallace. 42%, 34%, and 23%.
We skipped to later in the broadcast here, obviously.
The following states have now gone Republican or for Nixon: Kentucky, Vermont, and Kansas, with a total of 19 electoral votes. West Virginia has gone Democratic or for Humphrey for a total of 7 electoral votes. Alabama and Mississippi have gone Wallace for a total of 17 electoral votes. And we call your attention to this map. These states that you see on the map are states where the polls are still open. Voting is still in progress. We urge you again, if you live in one of these states, and if you have not yet voted, do so, go to the polls, and exercise your franchise of an American citizen. David?
Now let's look at Ohio. In Ohio, we have 6% of the vote now. Nixon is in the lead with 48%. Humphrey second with 40, and George Wallace 11%. Kentucky, 85% of the vote of Kentucky is in now. We projected the winner there some time ago, an hour or more, to be Nixon. And that's we projected 43%. He now.
Kentucky being just like Tennessee, it's an upland South state. So Nixon did a lot better than Wallace did. Wallace's support kind of fizzled out once he got north of Alabama, the Alabama-Tennessee state line.
Now has 44. In Kansas, 3% of the vote is in, and we have projected Nixon to be the winner there with 52%. In New Hampshire, 3% of the vote is in, and 3% in New Hampshire, a small state, is not very much, as you see, not very many votes. Nixon is in the lead, but we still don't have enough to say anything much, certainly anything conclusive about it. We'll be back in a moment.
Due to relaxed requirements for absentee ballots and the large number of servicemen in Vietnam and Europe, requests for such ballots this year have been at record levels. Both major parties have been courting an estimated 2 million eligible military voters. It's not possible to estimate the overall absentee vote because many states don't keep accurate totals of them. And in most states, absentee ballots are counted along with the regular votes. By the way, some of these ballots have to be counted tonight. Others may be counted several days later. In the state of Washington alone, there are an estimated 100,000 absentees. New Jersey has an estimated 112,000 absentee ballots. We know that there are at least 500,000 absentee ballots throughout the nation to be counted sometime before the books are finally closed on this election, and indeed there may be more than that. My attention has been called to the state of Tennessee. 39% of the vote is now in, and NBC News projects that Nixon has carried the state of Tennessee with 41% of the vote. To Sander Van Oker. Senator?
Chet, one of the races we're paying special attention tonight to is the Senate race in the state of Ohio between former Cincinnati Congressman John Gilligan, who defeated the incumbent Frank Lausche in the Democratic primary, and State Attorney General William Saxby, who now leads, as you can see. And why we're paying special attention to this is the role that labor is or is not playing in behalf of Gilligan. You see, the AFL-CIO didn't endorse Gilligan until September 27th, even though it gave him very great support against Lausche in the primary. And the reason it didn't was his lukewarm attitude toward Vice President Humphrey before the convention. He didn't endorse him until afterward. And his work in behalf of a dovish plank at Chicago on the subject of Vietnam. Allegedly, the AFL-CIO didn't give Gilligan enough money, gave him reportedly $100,000. He expected twice that much, and he had to cut down on his television time, which he didn't have to do in the primary.
Bunch of tit for tat. Backroom deals, yeah.
When he defeated Lausche. The trouble is that in the state... Yeah.
Go ahead. Well, go ahead. Wasn't Gilligan saying in Chicago that if they nominated Humphrey, it would make it very difficult for him to defeat him?
That was the whole point. The people like Gilligan, Bill Clark running against Dirksen, others like them in the platform.
So one thing I want to point out about this election, and historically speaking, is this was the first election in the modern era where Nixon, the Republican candidate, actively tried and court the union vote and the working, like the union vote. I mean, not just working class, but union working class vote. He liked to call them the hard hats. He would say, like, you got to get the hard hat vote and all that other stuff. It's kind of very reminiscent of what Trump was doing in 2016 and in 2024, but definitely to what he was talking about in 2016 and part of why he won, you know, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, those states. But it didn't start with him, and what he did wasn't new. Nixon really was kind of the pioneer of this strategy. He's known for the Southern strategy, which he incorporated in this election, but he was also, he's lesser known for the I don't know if I would call it like the Northern strategy, but the strategy of getting the hard hat vote.
Committee, they said we can't go home if we don't go home with a peace plan. And when he went home without a peace plan, he angered labor. He didn't satisfy the McCarthy supporters in the state. And if you don't have organized labor behind you and you're a Democrat in Ohio, you're in trouble, because when organized labor gets behind a candidate, as they did behind Stephen Young, you remember in '58, opposing John Bricker, who voted for right-to-work laws, then you as a Democrat are in deep trouble. And especially in the state of Ohio, because William Saxby was the only major Republican in the state in 1958 who opposed right-to-work. So it's a great question about...
And yeah, so as long ago as 1958, you had a Democrat who voted against right-to-work laws or voted against, you know, union legislation, and a Republican who actually was at least not opposed, if not supportive of it.
How much support Gilligan will get from labor. If he doesn't get a great deal, then he's going to be in deep trouble in Ohio.
Sandy, just glancing at your board, I can't quite see all of it, but it seems to me the only one still in doubt and on which we do not have a projected conclusion is Indiana again. What do you show there?
Indiana, we have the Republican, William Ruckelhaus, the majority leader of the House, with a pretty good lead over the incumbent Birch Bayh. And I suppose also you could say it's a great question in that state what organized labor is doing for Birch Bayh, because organized labor matters way up there in Lake County. And maybe if those voters, we don't know yet, are going for George.
Lake County is basically where Gary is. It's part of the Chicagoland area, Northwest Indiana, very labor heavy area, even to this day. I want to say Birch Bayh won this election because I know his son, I think Evan Bayh, was governor of Indiana. I think was a senator from Indiana in the 1990s and 2000s, I think. But I'd have to look it up. Don't quote me on that.
Wallace, I'm just projecting this. This may be hurting Birch Bayh. I think John Chancellor has some more information on what labor is doing in the presidential contest in Ohio. Is that right, John?
Yes, I do, and it's quite interesting. Vice President Humphrey is receiving 51% now by our calculations, and that's rough. He's receiving about half of the Union vote in Ohio, compared to about a third of the Union vote for Nixon, and what we calculate now at 17% for Wallace. This is very interesting. Wallace should have done better than that, but also Humphrey, according to the close connection between organized labor and Democrats in Ohio, should have done better. 50% of the vote is not as good as Lyndon Johnson's 3/4 of the labor vote, 78% in the final reckoning in Ohio in 1964. Also, Nixon, with about a third of the labor vote, is doing much better than the Republicans did in a two-way contest in Ohio 4 years ago.
You have to understand, back in the 1960s, a Republican winning a third of the labor vote was almost unheard of. That's kind of why this election was almost like one of those turning point elections that kind of helped shape it was the first election to really mold the modern current party system of the United States. And it really culminated, I think, in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan.
In that contest, running against President Johnson, the Republican Goldwater got 22% of the labor vote. Now, there are many complicated factors involving in this, but one of the suggested indications here in these figures is that organized labor coming out on behalf of Hubert Humphrey against George Wallace may in fact have won some votes in labor for Nixon, which is quite interesting. The turnout rate, the number of labor families that went to the polls today is, according to our estimates, a good bit higher than it was in 1964. So while the situation is mixed, Humphrey is not doing as well as the Democrats did 4 years ago in Ohio, but neither is George Wallace doing as well as he had hoped in that state. Nixon, as a matter of fact, is doing a little bit better in some Democratic areas than anybody had expected him to, and the Republican voters there who deserted the party, the Goldwater Republican Party 4 years ago, seem to be returning to the Nixon Party now. This is, I think, you'll see a good bit of this tonight. Vermont, traditionally a Republican state, deserted the Republican Party in 1964 and has returned to the fold this time. Now here's Frank McGee. Republicans had been expected to win some governor's races where popular Democrats decided either to retire or to seek another office, and that is happening tonight in Vermont. NBC News has projected a winner in the state of Vermont, the Republican Dean C. Davis, who currently is garnering 59% of the vote to the Democratic John Daley's 41%. Our projection is that when all the tabulating is done, Davis will be the winner by 58%. Interestingly enough, that's the same margin by which Nixon is currently carrying the state. Davis is 67 years old. He's chairman of the board of the National Life Insurance Company. He hasn't held an elective office in 30 years, and he's an old-line conservative. He said his recipe for the state of Vermont would be a little bit of fiscal conservatism, a little bit of economy in state expenditures, a little bit of slowing down, he said, to permit growth on the part of the state. He will take the place of Philip Hoff, the Democratic governor who retired after 3 two-year terms. It's a tough loss for the Democrat, John Daley, who at 45 years old is the father of 11 children. Had he won, he would have been the new champion in that department, surpassing New Jersey's Governor Richard Hughes, the current title holder, with 10 children. David?
Thank you. NBC News projects Nixon the winner in Florida, in the presidential election in Florida, with 40% of the vote.
All I can say about the number of children is, well, yeah, it was the baby boom era, I guess, still kind of the tail end. Americans were a lot more feral back then.
Turned out to be pretty close as forecast. Nixon has 38% in the votes we have already counted. We project that he will have 40 when they are all counted. Now we're going to look at 4 other states, beginning with Illinois. Illinois hasn't been closed very long, but we now have a few figures from there. Just a few. Nixon is ahead, but the figures are so few in number that they don't mean much. South Carolina, 5% in from South Carolina. That is Senator Strom Thurmond's home state. He has been working avidly, not to say eagerly, for Nixon, but in his own state at this early hour. It may not turn out that way at the finish, but at this early hour, George Wallace is first, Humphrey is second, and Nixon is third. In Arkansas, less than 1%, hardly worth spending any time on that. But anyway, there are first figures from Arkansas. There's too few to mean anything. In Georgia, 3% is in. Wallace is well in the lead in Georgia at this early hour, 52%, 13,000 votes, more than his 2 opponents combined. Chet?
Some more returns from various states. Indiana, for example. State of Indiana, 10% of the vote is now in. Nixon in the lead with 56% of the vote, Humphrey with 33%, and Wallace with 10% of the vote. State of Virginia, 7% of the vote is now in. Nixon in the lead with 39%, Wallace in second place with 31%, and Humphrey a close third with 29% of the vote. North Carolina, 6% of the vote is now in. Nixon again leading, but narrowly, with 33%. Humphrey with and Wallace in second place. Oh, let's start all over. Wallace leading with 35%. Nixon trailing closely with 33%. And again, Humphrey trailing closely with 31%. Tennessee, it is our projected conclusion that Nixon has carried the state of Tennessee. And by the way, the totals now in the electoral vote are as follows. Nixon now has, on a projected basis, 44 electoral votes. Humphrey has 7, and Wallace has 17. We'll be back in just a moment.
We're back. Let's take a look at Indiana first. In Indiana, with 10% of the vote in, we have projected Nixon the winner in Indiana with 48%. He has 56% now. We project that when they're all counted, he will win Indiana, 13 electoral votes there, with 48% of the vote. That means that Nixon now has won 5 states with a total of 44 electoral votes. He still has a long way to go, 270 it takes to win. Now let's look at the popular vote total. Nixon is in the lead with more than 1 million votes, 42%. Humphrey second with 34. George Wallace at this hour a strong third with 24. The others are Dick Gregory, Cleaver, McCarthy write-ins, and others. And at this hour they have 5,600, less than 1%. To Ed Newman. Ed?
Well, at this moment, David, about 40% of the House races have been decided. 163, as you can see. The Democrats have won 96 of them, the Republicans 67. And it may appear to be extraordinary that not one of those 163 seats that have been decided has changed hands. In itself, it suggests that there has been no big swing either way. But the fact is that almost without exception, these were safe or relatively safe seats for the party that holds them now. And probably it would have taken a very, very large swing in the vote to shift party control of any of them. We still have to wait for some key races in a state like New Jersey. New Jersey is a state with 15 congressmen. The Democrats have so far won 4. The Republicans have won 4. No change. We have to wait for key districts in Pennsylvania, which has 27 congressmen. The Democrats have won 9. The Republicans 12. Again, no change. In fact, with all these safe seats remaining safe, it appears that none of the House leaders from either party will lose today. Speaker John McCormick Democratic leader Carl Albert of Oklahoma, Gerald Ford of Michigan, the Republican leader, Leslie Aarons of Illinois, the Republican whip, Melvin Laird of Wisconsin, the chairman of the Republican Conference. Hale Boggs of Louisiana, the Democratic whip, did have a pretty tough fight. He is expected, however, to make it. Now, perhaps there must be one change in the committee chairmanship in the House. That's in the House Committee on Un-American Activities. The current chairman, Edwin Willis of Louisiana, was upset in the primary, so he will not be back in January. If Richard Icord, a Democrat of Missouri, wins his seat today, holds his seat today, he will be the new chairman. Now to Sander Van Oker.
We have another projected winner in a Senate contest, and that is in South Carolina, where NBC News is projecting that the incumbent, seeking his second term, Ernest Hollings, will win that race with 57% of the vote over his Republican opponent, Marshall Parker. That race was thought to be somewhat closer than it turned out to be because it was felt that Hollings had disappointed many of the Negro voters who first put him across when he ran for the Senate, but apparently he's doing very well, and we have projected him as the winner, Ernest Hollings, the incumbent. In New Hampshire, with early returns in, the incumbent Senator Norris Cotton is running, and these are early returns, quite a bit ahead of Governor John King, the Democrat. Governor King was first a supporter of the Johnson administration on Vietnam. Then he called for a bombing halt. Cotton has been holding pretty firm to a tough view on Vietnam, and it looks now that Governor King, who's been a very popular governor up there, is running pretty well behind with 5% of the votes in. Over in the close contest in Indiana, the incumbent Birch Bayh, seeking his second term, is running behind the Republican William Ruckelshaus. The first S in his name is pronounced, it's silent. William Ruckelshaus, who's the majority leader, he's just 35 years old. Bayh is 40, so that's a spirited contest now between two young men. Over in Ohio, there is another close contest between former Cincinnati Congressman John Gilligan, who is now trailing the State Attorney General, William Saxby. So far as we know, the expected heavy Democratic vote from Cuyahoga County has either not started to come in or is just trickling in at this point, but we'll be paying close attention to this close race. David?
At 8:20, the NBC News projection desk still sees the possibility of a close presidential race. There is nothing in the national popular vote total so far to show a big victory for either candidate. Nixon is in the lead in the popular vote, but the big industrial states of the North, where Hubert Humphrey's strength lies, have not yet been heard from. The percentage of vote for Wallace seems a little high, but perhaps because of the early closing time of states in the Deep South, where he is strongest. We'll be back in a moment.
All right, where are we now? Let's take a look at several states. Mississippi, for example. We have projected a winner in Mississippi. It is George Wallace. And our projection is that he will carry 60% of the vote. In Vermont, the projected winner is Nixon with 54% of the vote. In West Virginia, the projected winner is Humphrey with 54% of the vote. And in Florida, our projected winner is Nixon with 40% of the vote. Nixon has now carried 6 states with a total of 57 electoral votes. Wallace has carried 2 with a total of 17 electoral votes. Humphrey has carried the state of West Virginia with 7 electoral votes. Now to John Chancellor.
George Wallace may have done well in Mississippi, and that was no surprise, but what must make his people unhappy tonight is that they did not do well in Kentucky and Tennessee, and they are not doing well in Florida. George Wallace is currently 3rd in Florida with about a third of that vote, a little less.
Florida used to be a Deep South state. The 1950s and 60s were the first decades. You got a lot of people from the Northeast and the Midwest moving down there, the so-called snowbirds, and they help make the modern Florida like we all know today.
Tallied so far. It's interesting to look at the Wallace vote as we've been able to tabulate it here on our RCA computers in Kentucky. In the Louisville area, which is traditionally Republican, Wallace is getting about 16% of the vote, about the same that he's doing all across the state. In the poor farming region in the western part of Kentucky, Wallace is getting about 29% of the vote. That's no surprise. But in the Cumberland Mountains, which is an old Republican territory, part of Appalachia, Wallace has dropped down to about 14% of the vote, which is well below his showing all across Kentucky. And that means that George Wallace is not doing terribly well with the hill people in the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky, who have, as I say, been traditionally Republican. But all the indications from his candidacy this year seem to be that he would pick up votes with these people, and he's not doing very well. In the rest of Kentucky, where the votes add up to more than half the state's votes, Wallace is getting a little bit more than 16% of the vote. And when you look at the difference between the cities, the suburbs...
The modern day correlation about like the hill people versus the deep south and what John Chancellor's talking about, it's like in an election like this, I mean, obviously you can't compare different eras, but I mean, the hill people think if you're in like the gun enthusiast community, think Hickok 45 is the hill people, and then the deep south would be somebody like maybe Eric from Iraq Veteran 8888. I know that's a stupid comparison, but there is a difference. I mean,
the small cities and the rural areas. Wallace is doing his best in the suburbs, with about almost 20% of the vote we've been able to calculate so far in Kentucky for Wallace is coming from the suburbs. He's doing most poorly in the metropolitan areas, and of course that includes some Negro voters in Kentucky. He's down to 13%, and not enough in the countryside itself. So it would seem that with the suburbs, the voters there having indicated to all of us all year long that they feel that law and order, even though they may not have much crime themselves, that law and order is a very vigorous issue with them, that they may have responded to what George Wallace had to say. But he did not do as well as he expected it to elsewhere in Kentucky, and that's where George Wallace stands in that state now.
Nixon stole a little bit of his thunder when it came to the law and order vote, because he really emphasized it this election, and he turned it on full blast in 1972, which you'll see at the end of this stream.
That Senator Ribicoff retains his seat. I don't know what that projection means. We tried to correct it. We'll find out later. But anyhow, we are projecting that Senator Ribicoff will be the projected winner in the state of Connecticut. In that state, the main issue, it seemed to us, going around the state, was Congressman May accusing Senator Ribicoff of being way off base when, as you remember, Senator Ribicoff nominated George McGovern and said with George McGovern as...
I'm going to skip ahead now to a little bit later on in election night, not toward the end, but just so that, you know, we're not boring you to death over all the different happenings here. We'll go to I think the 11 o'clock hour on the East Coast. So here we go. Let's play this.
One of these is Texas, and as we have said, there's a computer in Dallas that isn't working, and so we may not be able to get their figures until tomorrow. If we could look at Texas now, here's what we see. 74% of the vote is in. Humphrey has a lead, but small. 42% to Nixon's 39. Neither of them has a majority, obviously. The majority was denied them by Governor Wallace, who got 19%. North Carolina settled a long time ago.
And as you can see with Texas, Texas is kind of a southern state, but it's also kind of a plain state and a western state. Texas is too far west for a candidate like Wallace to do very well in. Just like Tennessee and Kentucky are too far north, Texas is just too far west.
Who got 19.
And that's also why Texas voted Republican earlier than a lot of other southern states, and was actually kind of a, It voted for Eisenhower twice and this was an era, Texas was actually one of the keystone, like one of the key swing states in this era. And there are about 7 or 8 of them. And a lot of them were worth a lot of electoral votes. Texas being one of them. In this era, it leaned a little bit more Democratic than it did Republican. It was a lean blue state, I would say, but yeah, it's just a different era.
%. North Carolina settled a long time ago, projected a long time ago. 86% of the vote is counted, and the projected winner is Nixon with 39%, also not a majority.
Also, we're watching in color.
89% of that is in. We projected a long time ago that Nixon would be the winner, again without a majority, with 36% of the vote. One of the states still undecided is Missouri. 88% of the vote is in. It's too close to call. Humphrey has a small lead with 46% of the vote, and Nixon 43. It's too close. Montana, also too close. We have a fourth of Montana's vote in. Nixon is ahead, but not by much. 48% to Humphrey's 46. And that's too close to call. Chet?
Here are some returns from some other states, David. State of Washington. Way up in the northwest. State of Washington. 33% of the vote of the state of Washington is in. NBC has projected the winner there, Humphrey, with 49% of the vote. New Jersey, one of the key states, one of the industrial states, 74% of that vote is now counted, and it keeps getting closer. But Nixon is still in the lead with 46% of the vote. Humphrey has 45% of the vote. New York. Several hours ago, NBC projected that New York had gone into the Humphrey column with a vote of 50%. Illinois, another one of the key states, and where the issue is in contest. 46% of that vote is now registered. Humphrey continues to hold on, but it's much too close to call. Humphrey still has a 2 percentage point advantage. And Pennsylvania, another one that's all important. 86% of that vote is now in. Humphrey has a lead, 48% of the vote at this moment. Nixon trailing with 44%, and it's still too close to call. To Edwin Newman.
You'll recall that before the election there was a good deal of talk about apathy among Negro voters. Well, that talk does not seem to have been justified on the basis of some specially selected precincts around the country of which we made a survey. It appears that Negro voters are turning out in House races, at any rate, more heavily than they did 2 years ago. In fact, the increase in turnout is 22%. Furthermore, we find in this survey that black voters are going 93% for Democratic candidates. In fact, the black vote makes up a solid share of the Democratic vote in these precincts. It contributes 13%. And the Negro vote for Democratic candidates tonight is about 1% higher than it was 2 years ago. In the South, it appears that Negro voters are going Democratic to the extent of 97%, the other 3% going to the Republicans. I'd just like to mention a few individual races. I want to change something we said before. We said that in the 10th District of Florida, the incumbent representative, Republican Herbert Burke, had been defeated by the Democrat Elton Gissendanner. That is not correct. That race is now described as too close to call. It may depend on absentee ballots. One of the early leaders of the Dump Johnson movement, a strong critic of American involvement in Vietnam, has won election here in New York, Allard Lowenstein, who led the Dump Johnson movement, has defeated the conservative Republican Mason Hampton by about 4,000 votes out of 200,000. Another McCarthy supporter, David Ho of New Hampshire, you may remember him as he tried to use his Dartmouth College identification card to enter the Democratic Convention in Chicago. He lost in a district that last time turned out 67% for the Republican James Cleveland. This time that district went 75% for that same Republican James Cleveland. Once in Alabama, in Georgia, Charles Weltner, who's trying to get back into the House from Atlanta, has fallen behind the incumbent Republican Fletcher Thompson. Now to John Chancellor.
In Illinois, the lead Humphrey is holding over Nixon is now down to 25,000 votes. And this is very serious news. It means probably, by the traditional estimates of the Illinois vote, if they apply on this extraordinary night, that Humphrey will lose Illinois and its 26 electoral votes. The vote in Illinois is built up democratically within Cook County, and it moves out during the evening and moves.
Like, John Chancellor is my favorite of the secondary anchors or the analysts for NBC in this era, because he really knows politics and he explains Illinois very beautifully about how it votes, because he's originally from Chicago. So listen to his explanation here.
Moves downstate, where it is eaten away by traditional Republican votes in downstate Illinois. And that is the process that's going on now in Illinois. We have various other indicators. The Republican candidate for governor is getting 59% of the vote, and the very respected Chicago Sun-Times straw poll, as of November 1st, gave Nixon 47%.
I think the Republican governor of Illinois at that time, or who ran at that election and won, was Richard Ogilvie, but don't quote me on that. They got a big train station in downtown Chicago that's named after him.
To Humphrey's 39% of the Illinois vote. These indicators seem to me to add up to very bad news for Humphrey in a state with 26 electoral votes, which he now desperately needs. In Pennsylvania, it's mixed. Humphrey is ahead by about 4%, but it's a mixture that's very strange among various voting groups. For example, Nixon is doing well among high-income voters. Humphrey is doing well among low-income voters, and that about cancels itself out. The middle-income voters are even to both men. But Humphrey is not doing as well as he should with labor voters in Pennsylvania and generally around the country. He's running about 20 percentage points behind Lyndon Johnson's labor vote as tallied in the 1964 election. In New Jersey, Nixon is slightly ahead, and although Hubert Humphrey has been doing very well in the cities, the city of Newark in New Jersey accounts for only 4% of that state's vote. So it's difficult to see where Humphrey is going to pick up much support, although he could. It's that kind of night. In the farm states, Nixon has won 6, or is leading Hubert Humphrey in 6 of the 7 Midwest farm supports. But it's interesting to note that Nixon this time is not doing as well as he did in 1960 when he ran in those same states against John Kennedy. And our Oliver Quayle survey indicated that almost half of the voters in the Midwest farm states trusted Hubert Humphrey more than Richard Nixon to handle farm state problems. Now, Texas. In Texas, things look a little better for Humphrey, although we may never know. Because of that computer that Chet has referred to, the local Democrats, the state Democrats, are sweeping the state in Texas. They have gathered the votes from the Mexican-American and the Negro precincts, which they needed to win. They are winning, and this should help Humphrey very greatly. He's been holding a steady lead in Texas with its critical electoral votes of 42 to 39%. He has a small lead in all the income groups. So let's just take one very quick look now at the critical 7 states. In California, although it's too early to say, Nixon has a slight lead. Nixon has a slight lead in New Jersey. Nixon is ahead in Ohio. In Illinois, Humphrey may be technically ahead, but he's in trouble and in danger. In Pennsylvania, he's ahead by about 4%. In Texas, he is holding a lead, and in Missouri, he just took over the lead from Richard Nixon. So, if you take Nixon's 162 tallied electoral votes, which we have projected for him, and add the votes of California, New Jersey, Ohio, and Illinois, all states which are leaning toward him now for one reason or another, you get 271 electoral votes. Now back to David.
John, thank you. You do nice work. We have a projection.
God, I love all that math. And it's interesting to see how many electoral votes a lot of states were worth back then. Some states have gone down, some states have gone up. Like what Texas was, I think, worth 25 or 26 back then. Now it's worth 40. Illinois is now only worth 19. California, I think, was worth 40 this election, and it eventually got up to 55, but now it's back down to 54. So But yeah, those were all the key states in this era of American politics. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, California, Texas. Those 5 states were basically your big swing states. Well, I wouldn't call them all swing states, but those were the key. The person who was elected president almost always won most of those states. Those were the states that people looked at back in that era.
In the state of Maryland, NBC News now projects a victory for Humphrey in Maryland, a very narrow one, 43%. We'll be back in a moment. And I'm told that by way of satellite, NBC's election coverage is going to 25 countries around the world: Europe, Asia, Mexico, Latin America, Moscow, and so on. It would be nice if we could tell our friends in all these countries who are looking at us who will be the next president of the United States.
Yeah, this was the one that was first covered globally, too. Interesting.
But I regret to say we cannot. We can't tell the American people who will be the next president because we don't know. And we don't know when we will know. If you will look at our popular vote board, you will see why. Here's the result. At this hour, 3 a.m. in New York, 69% of the vote has been counted. That's 42-49, about 50 million votes counted, put on our board. And the result you see, Humphrey and Nixon are almost perfectly tied, difference of less than 100,000 votes, 42% for each of them. So as I say, we can't tell the viewers in other countries who's going to be the next president, and we can't tell the viewers in this country. Chet?
On the all-important Electoral College Board, 270 electoral votes are required for the winner. Nixon now has 162, Humphrey has 137, and Wallace, the third-party candidate, has 45. 10 states with a total of 194 electoral votes yet to be decided. Here are some returns from additional states. California, with 40 important electoral votes. 21% of that vote is now in. Less than 10,000 votes separate the two leading candidates. Nixon with 47%.
Man, California counted votes a lot faster back then.
Humphrey with 46%. The very important state of Pennsylvania. 89% of that vote is now counted. Humphrey still leads with 47%. Nixon, 45%. Iowa. NBC News projects a winner in Iowa. It goes to Nixon with 52% of the vote. In North Dakota, NBC projects a winner here as well, Nixon, with 56% of the vote. And in South Dakota, it's Nixon again with 55% of the vote. And I notice that a change has just now occurred in the returns from Illinois. There in Illinois, Humphrey has gone back into the lead. 58% of the vote is now in. They are virtually tied in the percentage column, each with 46%, but Humphrey now has a lead of about 19,000 votes. Speaking of Illinois, Humphrey is leading in Chicago by 250,000 votes, which puts him ahead of the old rule of thumb that a Democrat needs at least 200,000 majority coming out of Chicago in order to win the state. But right now, it's not enough to give him a secure lead in the state, with a considerable vote still to be counted. Only 58% of the vote in that state has been tabulated. One item of interest, certainly to Mayor Daley, is that although the Chicago turnout is about 5% below normal, the turnout in Republican Illinois is about 15% below normal. Now to Frank McGee.
Yes, Chet, and while Illinois is still far, far too close to try to make any projections as far as the presidential race is concerned, it's interesting to note that in the race for governor, the Republican Ogilvy has an 18-point lead over Democratic incumbent Shapiro, that with 57% of the vote counted. Among the 6 most populous states in the nation, Illinois is the only one that does not presently have a Republican governor, and that could be changed tonight. In some of the other races, there's close.
So let me think about that. So Illinois was the only one of the 6 largest states that did not have a Republican governor at this time. So what were the 6 largest? Okay, so New York had a Republican governor. Pennsylvania had a Republican governor. California had a Republican governor. Ohio had a Republican governor. I want to say the 5th largest state at this time, or one of the 5th largest, so that's 4. Illinois is among the 5. I want to say the last among the 6 most populous states at this time would have been Texas. Did Texas have a Republican governor in the late 60s? I'm gonna look this up, but I'm gonna let it keep playing.
Kansas is interesting, with better than 3/4 of the vote counted. The Democrat Docking is leading, but by only 4 percentage points. Now look at New Mexico. Better than 3/4 of the vote counted. 50-50 split. 400 vote difference between the 2 candidates. And in Arkansas, with 50% of the vote counted, Rockefeller, the Republican, 2 percentage points ahead of his Democratic challenger, Crank, but only about 7,000 votes separating them.
No, John Connally was governor, and I think he was a Democrat. So, but that means Texas would have been one of the 6 most populous states in 1968. New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, California. That's 5. I don't think Michigan was larger than Texas at this time, though, so he may have gotten it wrong.
We'll be back in just a moment. Now, this message.
Here again is Chet Huntley.
To the popular vote, 72% of the vote is recorded. Still, 42% to 42%. Nixon with a slight lead of 45,000 votes out of a total of 44, 51, 52 to 53 million votes. The state of Illinois, 59% of that vote is in. Humphrey still maintains a very slight lead, but the 2 candidates, Nixon and Humphrey, are virtually even with 46% of the vote. The key state of Ohio, where 76% of the vote is now in. There, Nixon leads with 46%, Humphrey with 42%. But 24% of that large state, 24% of the votes remain to be tabulated. In Missouri, this one is just about all over. 91% of the vote is in, and Humphrey continues to maintain a very thin margin, 45% to 44%. Texas. In spite of the broken down computer in Dallas, the vote in Texas is climbing and accumulating very slowly. 81% of the vote is now in, and there again, Humphrey continues to maintain a very small lead. 42% for Humphrey, 39% for Nixon. In Hawaii, NBC News projects that Hawaii has gone into the Humphrey column with 59% of the vote. And by the way, we just have a few new figures from California. 24% of the vote of California is now in, but it changes virtually nothing. Nixon has 47% of the vote, Humphrey 46%. David?
Now let's look at the electoral vote board, which also looks as if the numbers are painted on there because they haven't changed in a long time. But that's where it stands now. There's still 10 states out, too close to call. or 9 too close to call, plus Alaska, where we don't have enough figures yet. And that's where we stand. Either candidate could win a couple of states and not have enough electoral votes himself, but deny a majority to the other one. We don't know that that's what's going to happen, but it could happen. And we're waiting, as we have said before, at about this hour. I suppose the counters get tired, people who count the votes and so on. And the arrival of the votes begins to slow down. It may turn out that we'll have to wait for California. We only have 24% of California's vote to see who won, and we may not even see then.
It just changed, David.
Yes, we now have 26% in California. Nixon is still in the lead by about 20,000 votes, as you see, and with a 1 percentage point lead. In Utah, by the way, the big issue this year was not Vietnam or crime or any of that. There is an issue of money versus morals in Utah, and morals won. The issue was liquor by the drink. And there were many speeches about how much money it would mean to the state and so on, and other speeches about the morality of selling liquor by the drink. And the last figure we have is 82,000 votes against liquor by the drink and 46,000 in favor. And emotions, as they say, ran high. John Chancellor. John?
I've been reading the newspapers. We read the papers here fairly carefully, and one of the things that we've made a lengthy tally of in the last few days are the surveys taken by major newspapers with large political staffs and one magazine. They help us in making some of our calculations on the elections, and they've turned out to have a reasonably good record this time. The ones we're going to talk about now are the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Newsweek magazine, all of whom sponsored and paid for elaborate surveys using their own people and others borrowed from other organizations. All of them called Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas for Wallace, but that wasn't very hard to do. All of them did a hard thing. All three of these organizations called Kentucky for Nixon. That was a difficult one. And the Washington Post alone called Nixon for Tennessee and North Carolina. The Post and the New York Times were correct in their assessment that Nixon would take Florida. In the East, the New York Times alone of these organizations was correct in predicting that Hubert Humphrey would carry Maryland. The Washington Post and, incidentally, the New York Daily News, in a very accurate poll, were correct on Humphrey taking New York. All of them called Maine and Massachusetts, but again, those weren't very difficult calls this year. Out in the Middle West, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Newsweek magazine survey called Indiana, which went to Nixon as expected. The Washington Post, the New York Times had Humphrey in Michigan correct, and in Minnesota. In Ohio, they all called that state for Nixon, and Nixon is now ahead, but only slightly. That's a cliffhanger. And they all, interestingly enough, called Illinois, which is as yet undecided, for Nixon. In the mountain states, they all called, in the farm states, they all called the predictable sweep for Nixon in the farms. They all predicted Missouri for Nixon, and the Times hedged a little bit in its prediction for Missouri. But Humphrey now has a slight lead, and they may be wrong on that one. On the far west, all of them called Oregon correctly, gave it to Nixon. The Washington Post thought that Nixon might take Washington. The other two wouldn't say, and Humphrey took Washington. And California, these polls, the Washington Post, the New York Times, were made on November 3rd, thereabouts. The Newsweek poll was made about 10 days before the election. They all called it for Nixon with varying degrees of hesitancy, California. But the Los Angeles Times final poll said it was almost a toss-up, and the figures we see coming in on the board now are really only 1 percentage point across, with the number of precincts reporting at 26%. So we'll have to see how right or how wrong the surveys have been, but so far, as you look across the country on the map we kept, they did fairly well. And if you'll notice that the popular vote is almost identical, so did the major national polls. The surveyors and pollsters have really not had too bad a year. Now here's Chet.
Well, something new has happened in the state of Wisconsin, if we may. NBC News now projects that Wisconsin will go to Nixon with 47% of the vote. So add 12 more precious electoral votes to the Nixon column, giving the Republican candidate now 25 votes, 25 states rather, and 174 electoral votes.
Here we go.
Humphrey has carried 12 on the basis of our projections, with a total of 137 electoral votes, and Wallace has a total of 45. As David mentioned a moment ago, this undoubtedly is as far as George Wallace can go, because he is not considered to be a strong contender in any of the states which are still in doubt. We still stand at 26%, by the way, from California. Nothing has changed there. Pennsylvania remains practically the same. So does Illinois. So does New Jersey. Wait a minute. We do have a new figure coming up from Illinois. 62% of the vote is now in from Illinois, and the gap has closed once again. Nixon has now taken the lead once more in the state of Illinois with a margin of about 6,000 votes. But for all intent and purposes, they both have 46% of the vote. 38% of that big Illinois vote, however, still remains to be counted. That one is very much up in the air. Texas, we still have only 81% of the vote, no change there. Missouri, 91% of the vote, and Humphrey still has a narrow lead there. To the NBC News projection desk, it seems more and more that the presidential election is going to hinge on the results from California. And the vote from California is coming into our elections central slowly. There are 9 states, actually, where the races still are too close for NBC. The presidential election is going to hinge on the results from California. And the vote from California is coming into our elections central slowly. There are 9 states, actually, where the races still are too close for NBC News projection desk to pick a winner. Of the 9, Nixon is leading in Alaska with 3 votes, California with 40, Montana with 4, New Jersey with 17, Ohio with 26. NBC News has just projected Wisconsin in his behalf, 12 electoral votes there. Now, Humphrey, on the other hand, is leading in Missouri with 12, Pennsylvania with 29, Texas with 25, see, in Illinois, we now have Nixon back in the lead. Well, so on the basis of assigning arbitrarily the electoral votes to the candidate leading in the popular vote at this moment, we must say that the whole issue is still very much in doubt, and therefore could come down to the state of California with the 2 candidates virtually even. And California could yet, at some early hour this morning, some late hour this morning, resolve the entire thing. We'll be back in just a moment. Will indeed rest with California. David?
Here are the other four states still in doubt, beginning with New Jersey. We have 86% of the vote counted, and it's still too close to call for reasons you can see there. 46% of it for Nixon and 45 for Humphrey. A difference of about 48,000 votes out of 2,700,000, something like that. Ohio, big industrial state with 26 electoral votes. Either candidate would be delighted to have it. At the moment, Nixon has a lead of about 110,000 votes, and he has 46% to Humphrey's 42. Pennsylvania, 92% in. Humphrey is ahead, but not very far. 47% to Nixon's 45. And Texas, 85% of the Texas vote is in. Humphrey has a lead there, but not a very big one. And again, we don't know how much of the Texas vote we're going to get tonight or today. It's 5 o'clock now in the east. because, as we reported earlier, a computer in Dallas counting some of the votes broke down, and I don't know how long it's going to take to fix it. John Chancellor. John?
I've been checking the various surveys that were made by people involving the votes to be cast in some of these states which are still uncertain and now becoming critically important to the outcome of the election. Illinois, as we said before, had been unanimously predicted for Nixon by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Newsweek survey. Ohio had been unanimously given to Nixon by the same three organizations. New Jersey had been given to Nixon by the same organizations, but with a little less certainty. They hedged a little bit on New Jersey, but both the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Newsweek surveys gave that state to Nixon. Missouri had been given to Nixon by the same three organizations. Texas was a toss-up in all the polls and surveys. Nobody would guess anything on Texas, but in terms of Pennsylvania, here's another state that, pardon me, that is in the balance, and all of the surveys gave that to Nixon. Now, I think this is important because the surveys so far have had a rather high degree of accuracy. And if they were actually determining the true intent of the voters at the time they made the polls, and two of these surveys were made and published around the 3rd of November, they were very late, then Nixon, in terms of these uncertain states, has a little bit of an advantage. And I think that's about all we can say now. The mathematics of it are fairly clear. If he wins Illinois and California and Ohio, then either New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Alaska, Missouri, and Texas, a combination in there, will put him over the top. And I think we just have to wait for a while and see. Indeed, the votes may not be in tonight for us to determine that. But in the meantime, somebody?
Those surveys are extremely good. In the states they gave to Nixon that you were reading there, Nixon is ahead in all of them except Pennsylvania. It's very close there.
Well, Illinois is an interesting state, David. If you think about it, it reminds me very, very much of 1960 when John Kennedy was running in Illinois against Nixon, and we had the same sort of thing at almost the same hour. And the spread now is not
8,000.
It's 8,000, and that's what it was in the 1960 election. It was 8,000 odd votes that went to John Kennedy when a Chicago vote, if you'll recall, I think it was 100 or 200 or 300 precincts in Chicago turned up quite late in the evening, and that pushed Kennedy over the line and won him that state's 26 electoral votes. And a lot of people say the election, at least the Chicago Democratic Party has been saying it won him the election for a long time. And it's quite interesting to me to see that we're in the same position at the same hour now, 8 years later, in that interesting state, Illinois. Something to think about. We'll be back in a minute.
Milk.
Nobody's claimed any victory, by the way. No one. There were speeches and statements by Humphrey, Muskie, Agnew, Wallace, and LeMay. And we're going to put them on now in that order.
May I take a moment just to thank you, first of all, for your patience tonight. You have waited a long time, and I have waited an equally long time. And I wanted to take just a moment to come here to express my thanks to all of my many friends, particularly here at home, and the many that have come from other parts of the nation, for your wonderful support, and to tell you that I feel sufficiently at ease so that I want to get a good night's rest. Some members of my family have already seen fit to retire in confidence, and others have decided to stay up. But we have, as you know, several of the very important states that are nip and tuck, where the decision, I'm sure, will not be known until sometime at least late tomorrow. And if you want to stay up to wait for all of that, I'm all for you.
You can tell there's kind of a little bit of doubt in his voice. You can kind of tell.
But you've been watching the television, and you've been listening to the reports, and I believe that it's fair to say that we have done much better than most observers had thought we would, and about as good as I thought we would. Now, there are critical states yet to be heard from. They're not finalized as yet. States such as Ohio, and Illinois, and the states such as California, the state of Washington. And as you know, this is at best, as we put it, a Donnybrook. Anything can happen. We don't worry about
so close that the chances appear to be increasing that the election may be thrown either into the Electoral College or into the House of Representatives. Does that frighten you?
Well, I think it would be better for the country if we could decide the election one way or another today, because I think to leave it undecided for weeks or months could create a great deal of unrest throughout the country, which might be harmful. I gather that about 35% of the vote is in, at least it was when I left the motel, and that if it goes into the House, it'll be for a reason we didn't anticipate. That is, the Wallace vote isn't really as strong as we thought it might be, and so if it goes into the House, it'll go into the House because the two leading candidates are so close in so many parts of the country.
You seem to have about 57% in the state of Maine. Does that displease you?
Oh, it could be better.
Have you talked to Vice President Humphrey at all this evening?
No, not yet. I expect he's had as much difficulty getting to a phone as I have. Most of the evening has been sort of in the nature of a homecoming, and it's been good to see friends. And for those of you here in the audience, the photographer for Time magazine has been traveling rather definite.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just to save some time.
It is a rather late hour, isn't it? Something like 25 minutes of 4. And I guess everyone has been watching with as much interest as I have back at Government House, and it's perfectly obvious to anyone that the results are inconclusive at the moment. I do feel that trends are developing that are very helpful to the ticket, and I feel most optimistic. I've talked with Mr. Nixon on the phone just about 10 minutes ago. He shares my feeling that these trends are developing in a most satisfactory way for us. We certainly aren't predicting at this moment a victory. We are feeling to some extent encouraged beyond what we expected to be at this hour. I want to express my appreciation to the people here and the people across the country for the wonderful support they've given the team, and I would guess that there'll be no substantive announcements, conclusive announcements this evening.
In which no decision has been made, and in some combination of those 7 states resides the decision, and in which no decision
that we've encountered in the past 8 years.
There are now 7 states in which no decision has been made, and in some combination of those 7 states resides the decision as to who will be the next president of the United States. The Popular Vote Board now indicates that 83% of the vote is in And in the percentage column, the two candidates, Nixon and Humphrey, are virtually in a tie, with Nixon about 300,000 votes up. Insofar as electoral votes are concerned, Nixon has 195, Humphrey has 137. Nixon needs 75 more to win the election.
And so I think they had called New Jersey and Montana for Nixon, and that gave him 195. So that's why his electoral vote count has gone up just a little bit from the last time.
Now these states, Alaska, with 3 electoral votes, Nixon is currently leading. But with only 30% of the vote in, Nixon 47%, Humphrey 43%. California, 47% of the vote is counted. Nixon with a slight advantage, 47% to Humphrey's 46%. Illinois, 79% of the vote is in. Again, the two candidates are virtually in a tie. Missouri, 94% of the vote is in. Humphrey with a slight advantage, 45% to Nixon's 44%. Pennsylvania, 92% of the vote is in. Humphrey with 47%, Nixon with 45%. And finally, Texas, 85% of the vote is in. Humphrey with an advantage of 42%, 39% for Nixon. We shall be back in just a moment.
These are the kind of men we had in mind when we designed the super rugged, super waterproof Bull of Ocean.
Daniel Brewster for the Senate in Maryland. Republicans Goody, Bell, Morton, and Hogan have won Maryland congressional seats. In Virginia, Washington suburban Republican Congressmen Broyhill and Scott have won re-election. The only clear winner in the D.C. school board race is civil rights activist Julius Hobson, who won transit, as did Prince George's County, Maryland. Full color 4.
NBC News election coverage continues. And here once again is Chet Huntley.
The popular vote. We have been here now for 12½ hours by my reckoning, and we still don't know who the next president of the United States is. But as far as we've been able to progress, there it is. 83% of the national vote is in. Humphrey has 43% of it, and Nixon has 43% of it, with a slight edge going to Nixon. There are now 4 states still undetermined. There are 7 states, actually, still undetermined. But in 4 of them, Nixon holds a current advantage. Let's take a look at them. Alaska is the first one. 30% of the Alaskan vote is in, and it gives an advantage to Mr. Nixon of 47%, with 43% for Humphrey. California, 55% of that vote is in, and 55% of that vote has been there for at least an hour or hour and a half. And Mr. Nixon there holds a very thin advantage, 47% to 46% for Humphrey. Illinois is another key one, in which Nixon currently holds a slight advantage. But in the percentage column, as you can see, the two are just about...
It looks like his advantage creeped up a bit. And this might be indicative of Chicago not providing the votes that were provided in 1960. So we'll see.
Equal, but an advantage in numbers of about 45,000 in behalf of Nixon. And in Ohio, 94% of the Ohio vote is in, and indeed has been in for several hours. But the numbers and the percentages give a slight advantage to Mr. Nixon. 45% for Nixon, 43% for Humphrey.
David? Well, let's look at the electoral totals, because that's where the election will be decided. And when we do, we see that Nixon has 195 electoral votes, Humphrey has 137, and Wallace 45. John Chancellor is sitting over there with some kind of marvelous and perhaps magic machine with him. But about 5 minutes ago, he used a pencil and a yellow pad and deduced that Humphrey... didn't you?
Yes, I did, but I'm revising the figures, and I have them ready, but they're not quite what I gave you because I've been used to this machine.
I was very impressed with them, and I was about to...
This is going to be some great analysis here, by the way, that his successors, like Tim Russert in the 90s and 2000s before he passed away, and now Chuck Todd and Harry Enton do on various news networks about doing live math on the Electoral College and what's likely to happen as the election goes.
Repeat them.
Well, I think you ought to be careful. That's why I've asked to come back on as soon as I can. I have them ready now if you want to go through.
All right, go ahead.
The position we're in now is that it looks as though it's going to be very, very difficult for Hubert Humphrey to win a majority in the Electoral College. Let's take as our figures the 7 states which are still unsettled.
This was basically when they finally determined that Humphrey was not going to be able to win the electoral vote and probably wouldn't be president without some deals going on in the House, which may or may not have happened.
In this election, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Missouri lean toward Nixon at this moment. He's a little bit ahead in them. Now he has toward Humphrey. Humphrey has 137 electoral votes. If we give him the states he's leading in now, that will bring his electoral total to 203 votes, which is still 67 votes short of a majority in the Electoral College. So to win, Humphrey would need to carry Texas, Pennsylvania, and Missouri. They're all leaning toward him now a little bit. And then to pick up California, plus either Ohio or Illinois, plus Alaska. If he missed on Alaska and got either Ohio or Illinois, he'd get 269 electoral votes and would lose the election. Now, Nixon is in a much stronger position. I said a little while ago that he might make it without California. He has to have California to make it, as I see it. But if we take his 195 electoral votes that he has now, and we put in Alaska leaning to him, Ohio, he's ahead, Illinois, he's a little bit ahead, California, he's a little bit ahead, that brings his electoral vote total to 290 votes. So that Richard Nixon, as it stands now, can lose either Ohio or Illinois and Alaska and still come in and win this election with 271 electoral votes. So California is still essential to either man, but the odds are getting very long on Hubert Humphrey being able to pull this one off. And that's where we stand now.
As I say, I found that analysis impressive and was about to repeat it. But since you have, I don't need to. Thank you. And now we're going to look at Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Texas, 3 of the remaining undecided states. First, Missouri. 94% of it is in. It's very close. There's a difference of about 11,000 votes. Humphrey has 45%, Nixon 44%. It is so close that we are unable to project the outcome in Missouri. In Pennsylvania, Humphrey has a small lead, has had for some time, 47% to Nixon's 45%. That also is too close to call, and so we're not calling it. And Texas, 85% of Texas has been counted. Humphrey has a lead there of 3 percentage points. Let's go back to Pennsylvania, where I think something is about to happen. In fact, I know something is about to happen. No, not there. NBC News now projects Humphrey to be the winner in Pennsylvania. And the projection is that when all the votes are added, all of them are counted, he will come out with 47%. Now let's look at the electoral board. Have you got it up there yet?
No, it hasn't been added. So
it's not there yet. So add Pennsylvania's 29 votes to Humphrey's 137, and it gives 166. And 13 states for 166 votes, and that leaves 6 undecided.
So it's as Chancellor said, more and more concentration on California, with Pennsylvania now going to Humphrey. It's our attention and on the significant centers on California.
I think it was 11 or 12 o'clock last night when somebody said it was very likely to come down to California, and it's becoming increasingly apparent that's what might happen.
Yes, Jack.
Here. Now that Humphrey has taken Pennsylvania, if he holds on to Missouri and he holds on to Texas, and he picks up either Ohio, Illinois, or California, he will throw it into the House of Representatives.
Okay.
And it's a distinct possibility, yeah.
We'll be back in a moment.
American Motors introduces the Ambassador SST.
I'm here to pick up the Winthrops.
The Ambassador offers a longer wheelbase for that posh limousine ride. Velvet velour seats and air conditioning is standard equipment. It's the popular priced car that will
enjoy
pass
these
for a
old TV
limousine.
commercials.
The Ambassador will get you through the gate.
I completely agree with you. Portofino at this time of the year is a dreadful ball.
After that, you're on your own.
Gentlemen, I assure you, Mrs. Van Dome hadn't lost their contact lenses in the car. It would never have happened. I know I speak for my host when I say that...
Well, we are down now to 6 states where no decision can yet be made. Nixon is leading in 4 of them. Humphrey is leading in 2. Nixon is leading in Illinois, Ohio, Alaska, and California. Humphrey has a slight lead in Missouri and Texas. And the electoral vote standing is 195 for Nixon and 166 for Humphrey, 45 for Wallace. Now to Herbert Kaplow at the Nixon headquarters in New York.
I am in the ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, where just a few hours ago there was quite a bit of activity. Several hundred Nixon supporters waiting here, hoping for a victory that has so far eluded them. Only slight margins.
Have you any idea why California is so... Have you any idea why California is so slow in coming? Polls closed 8 hours ago, and we only have 55% of it.
David Brinkley asking all the right questions.
At the risk of getting some very bad fan mail that you mentioned earlier, I sometimes wonder if some of these states don't hold back their votes on purpose because it creates some consternation. The name gets mentioned very frequently, and it causes quite a stir. I don't know. We speculated earlier that maybe those Los Angeles County ballots were still somewhere piled up in trucks navigating down the freeway to go to the counting machine.
Well, I could have walked over there by now.
Hubert Humphrey's headquarters are in a Minneapolis hotel, and NBC News correspondent Jack Perkins is there. Jack?
Chet, this is the ballroom where it looks like the party is over. And Mr. Humphrey, of course, is up in his room and is presumably sleeping. We don't know. About 4 hours ago, he stood at this podium and said that, quote, I feel sufficiently at ease to get a good night's rest. And he went up to his room, and it was said that he was going then to go to sleep. I don't know whether he can sleep through tonight or not. But since then, we have heard nothing publicly from him, and we are not expecting to hear anything more from him for at least 3 hours. From some of his friends and aides, we have heard a few comments, and they are words of discouragement. Jack Perkins, NBC News, the Leamington Hotel, Humphrey headquarters in Minneapolis.
I think they
Sorry,
figured out they lost.
we were unable to get the picture, but verbally, I think you got the picture at any rate. To Sander Van Oker.
Chet, we still have those 4 races undecided. They haven't changed in the last half hour. In Iowa, with 95% of the vote now counted, we still find it too close to project. Governor Harold Hughes leads David Stanley, so the other way. Well, anyhow, race. Mike Gravel, the Democrat.
So this one's interesting. This is the same Mike Gravel who ran for I think he ran for the Democratic nomination for president as recently as, was it 2016 or 2020? One of those years? Yeah.
Leads Elmer Rasmussen. The Republican Ernest Greening, the man that Gravel beat in the primary, is not doing too well with his writing campaign. We're not even sure that writing campaign is legal. Frank?
Thank you, Sander. We had 21 governor's races. We have projected winners in 18 of them, meaning that 3 of the governor's races remain unsettled at this hour. And here is where they stand, beginning with Arkansas. 65% of the vote counted. Percentage standpoint, an even division, 50-50, a difference of about 1,000 votes for Republican Rockefeller over Democrat Frank. Another undecided race is in Illinois. Now, with 80% of the vote counted, the Republican Ogilvie has about 344,000 votes over the Democratic 50-50, a difference of about 2,000 votes there in favor of the Republican incumbent Dave Cargo. So the remaining 3 races, the Republicans lead in all 3, but they held 2 of them going into the election this year, so they stand to make a net gain in what remains open of only 1. Of the 18 races that we've called, 10 have gone to the Republicans, 8 to the Democrats, representing a net gain so far of 4. If the trend that we've just seen continues, they would pick up 1 more for a net gain of 5. Edwin?
Well, we've been saying from the beginning of the evening, and it didn't take any great perspicacity to do so, that there were 2 questions to follow in the House. One was which party would control the House, that is to say, which party would have the greater number of members, and the other question was which party would control the state delegations, a matter of consequence in case the presidential election went there. Well, nominally, the Democrats now control enough to elect a president. If the election goes into the House, they have 26, the Republicans have 15. 5 are tied. There are 4 more to go. But remember that of those 26, a number of them are in the South, including 5 that went to George Wallace for the presidency. That doesn't count South Carolina, which Richard Nixon took. So if it does go into the House, those figures mean less than they appear to, and I guess I've said that often enough now, and that's sufficiently understood. It must have been clear to you that the lights were going out all over the NBC studio. One was tempted to say one didn't know when they'd go back on again, but they went back on very quickly. So let's go to another board, the recap board. As you can see, the Democrats have won 240 seats, the Republicans 184. The Republicans have gained 3. The Democrats are assured of a majority. They are already 22 seats past the needed 218, and we think they're going to get a few more. And Republicans 192, net gain of 4 for the Republicans. Gratifying performance by the Democrats in the House. The people have evidently said they like the House about the way it is now, just with its political balance as it is now. They don't want any changes. Now, we'll be back in a minute.
Okay, we're on the home stretch. We're going to skip ahead a few hours to the morning after. It's going to be sunrise, and this is when I believe they'll actually call the election.
Well, we've had an extraordinary four or so hours to go through waiting for this decision finally to be made, the decision that Richard Nixon is the president-elect of the United States, as he now is. If you go back a bit, you go back to the vote in California, When California swung to Nixon, that was the beginning of the end. That was one of the key states that he needed, and conversely.
And so in the 4 hours since when they started counting again, they called California for Nixon. That basically wiped away Humphrey's chances at at winning the Electoral College. They were already slim to begin with the previous night.
That Humphrey needed, and we declared California for Nixon at 7:49 Eastern Time, and we followed that by declaring Ohio for Nixon at 7:50 Eastern.
This is basically a 1-2 punch. They called California and Ohio for Nixon, so all he really needed at this point was just one more state.
Time 1 minute later, and there within 2 minutes he'd picked up a very large number of votes, and it looked as though he would go over the top very quickly. And then we had a delay that went on for very nearly 3 hours. Very nearly 3 hours, during which I imagine questions were rising in many people's minds. But
they finally called Illinois, and Illinois was the one that put Nixon over the top.
Was holding up the vote in the remaining key states of Missouri, Texas, and Illinois.
Yeah, if you believe the whole, if you believe the theory that Democrats dumped ballots in 1960, you could say in 1968, Richard Daley, the mayor, was pissed off enough that he's like, "Yeah, hold back the ballots. Just go have your scrambled eggs and milk."
Finally, a few minutes ago, we were able to declare Illinois for Nixon. That put him over the top. That gave him the majority of electoral votes that he needed, 287, 17 more than required. What was holding up Illinois, we still don't know. To this moment, we don't know what is still holding up Missouri. We still don't know where, incidentally, Hubert Humphrey is still slightly ahead. We still don't know what's holding up the state of Texas, where Hubert Humphrey is still slightly ahead. The state of Alaska is not nearly so much of a problem for two reasons. It's a very large state with relatively few people, and it takes longer to collect the votes there. And in the second place, it can't be a crucial state because it doesn't have enough electoral votes to be. Nixon needed, toward the end, either Missouri, Texas, or Illinois. He's got Illinois. He may still get Missouri and Texas. That remains to be seen. In any case, he has enough. Now here's John Chancellor.
Look at the popular vote board to show you just how close this election is. Those percentage points for Nixon and Humphrey don't really go far enough, the 43%, 43%. Actually, if you tally that vote, Nixon has 42.8% of the vote, and Humphrey has 42.5% of the vote. The 190,000 vote lead that Nixon has over Humphrey represents about 0.28% of the total popular vote recorded so far. And this is interesting and quite interesting in politics. It was just reversed 8 years ago. John Kennedy had 49.7, Nixon had 49.5. And the margin of difference was down to the 100th, exactly the same, except that it is reversed this time. I wonder if we could have a look at Illinois. The vote has advanced in Illinois, but the lead which Humphrey is holding, which Nixon is holding in Illinois, is exactly the same. A few minutes ago, with lower figures than this, fewer votes being counted, the lead was 116,000, and I think now the lead, Nixon's lead, is 116,000, and this supports our projected winner thesis that Nixon has indeed, with 93% of the precincts in, won Illinois' 26 electoral votes, which put him over the top.
John?
Yes.
And Ed, a lot of people, I think, are waking up now on the West Coast. I'm sure a lot of people went to bed around 1 or 2 o'clock. And I think I was thinking about this when Ed was talking. It might be worthwhile to just mention again how at one time in the early hours this morning, you could see on the face of Professor Paul Freund, the Harvard constitutional expert, the mirror of a first-class constitutional crisis in the making. And all of us in this studio were reflecting on that. Now, it's over now. But about 8 hours ago, we thought we had a full-fledged constitutional crisis in the making.
And I think there's one very important point to be made now that everybody is relieved that we won't have to go through a constitutional crisis.
Can I get it?
The tendency is going to be to forget it. The tendency is going to be, well, it didn't happen. The American system in terms of the Electoral College is basically sound. We won't have to worry about this happening again. The next president will be more popular. But I think everybody ought to remember the agonizing hours we went through around dawn today here in the East when it began to look very much as a reasonable possibility that this would have to be settled in the House of Representatives. And as I think I said earlier, that this great constitutional pigeon would come home to roost.
Well, John, let me make a point about this, if I may. It is a fact that the constitutional crisis has been avoided. As you say, this is a point that's going to be made in an attempt to forget about this whole question. But it's very interesting that it has been avoided in an election this close, in which, as you were saying, the difference between Nixon and Humphrey was roughly 1 vote out of every.
Yeah, it came close. If about, I think, 150,000 votes swung in different directions in, I think, 2 states, it would have been thrown to the House of Representatives.
400, and in addition to that, George Wallace was, I suppose, the strongest third-party candidate of all time, with the possible exception of Theodore Roosevelt, who wasn't really a third-party candidate. And
George Wallace, as of today, was the last third-party candidate to win electoral votes.
Really a second Republican candidate. And nevertheless, in spite of the closeness of the vote between Nixon and Humphrey and the presence of George Wallace in the election, the constitutional crisis has been avoided. Now, that's a pretty good argument, I think, and I think it's going to vitiate a lot of the drive for.
Nixon ran a very, very shrewd campaign, and I think him getting the Electoral College majority without it being thrown to the House is kind of a testament to that. This election, that's why this election is actually one of my favorites historically.
A reform of the Constitution so that this possibility will not occur again.
Ed, I don't think so. You know, they used to say God protects drunks, babies in the United States of America, but a lot of people have had their hearts chilled by this experience. And you know, in the Congress over the years, there has been reform efforts made by a body of people, Carl Mont, a Republican, John F. Kennedy when he was a senator, to do this. I think there is going to be a movement for reform. Now, like all great changes in a country like ours, they will not come quickly. However, they will come.
Sandy, I think that we ought to add that it wasn't just Karl Mont, and it hasn't been people in this century, that in 1824, a committee of the United States Senate argued for the abolition of the Electoral College, and they made what seems to me then is the argument we ought to use now, that electors, these faceless people who have so much to do with the choosing of our presidents, if they do their job, they're useless. If they don't do their job, they're dangerous. I see no reason for having them. I don't know if we take partisan positions on this, but the vagaries of the Electoral College almost brought us into crisis this time, and I do think something ought to be done about it.
Well, John, I think that phrase is unanswerable. If the electors do their job, they're useless. If they don't do their job, they're dangerous. I quite agree. All I'm saying is that I think that the constitutional crisis, having been avoided in so phenomenally close an election, may take a lot of the drive out of the campaign to bring about constitutional reform, which is difficult to bring about at the best of times, in the best of circumstances, and even on questions that everybody approves of, or virtually everybody approves of.
Gentlemen,
but we'll see. What's the point? The point is that Richard Nixon is now the president-elect of the United States. Sandy, did you have a...
They want to break away for just a second. We may have to go over to Mr. Nixon's news conference just to take a quick look at some Senate races that are as yet undecided. If we can look at the Senate board, first the state of Iowa. Governor Harold Hughes, that race is just too close to call. Over state legislator Dave Stanley, that is just too close to call. It's about 500 vote difference. In the state of Oregon, where Senator Wayne Morris is seeking a 5th term, he has been behind all night state legislator Robert Packwood. That vote percentage is 2% with 83% of the vote in. In the state of Ohio, Congressman John Gilligan from Cincinnati. He has been trailing Attorney General William Sachs several hours ago, radiating optimism. And remember that time when he said, all of you know I'm an optimistic man. That was the essential Hubert Humphrey. He started with tremendous handicaps in this campaign because the convention was not his, the beginning of the campaign was not his, but finally he became his own man.
From NBC News Election Central,
Here we go.
A special one-hour edition of the news. Reported by Chet Huntley and David Brinkley.
Nixon's the one. That's the natural banner for any sprightly front page tonight. At almost midday Eastern Time, NBC News projected Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, when it became evident he had carried Illinois. Final returns may well reveal that indeed it was Mayor Richard Daley's Illinois and Mayor Richard Daley's Chicago which averted a deadlock and a political constitutional crisis of incredible proportions. 94% of the popular vote is counted. There are the numbers. An hour or so ago, I carried the percentages out to 6 digits, and it went like this. Nixon, 43.2959%. Humphrey, 43.2584%. Wallace, 13.4457, and now it's gone a little over 14. In short, Nixon and Humphrey are separated by about 375 thousandths of 1%. The electoral vote shows Nixon with 287, Humphrey with 166, and Wallace with 45. David?
As it turned out, in the late, tired hours of last night or the early, tired hours of this morning, Richard Nixon won the election this time where 8 years ago he lost it in Illinois. It was so close it took forever, but he won it, and in winning that he won the presidency. It was, again, one of the closest elections in American history, closer even than when Nixon lost to Kennedy 8 years ago. His lead over Humphrey in the popular vote is still only about 25,000 votes, or about 1/5 of a vote per precinct. There are states where we still don't know, even now, for certain, who won. But whichever way these states go now, they can't change the outcome. Here, with the figures up to this minute, are some of the big, important states that kept Nixon, Humphrey, and the country waiting all night to see what happened, beginning with New York. There's the result. Humphrey won it. In Michigan, Humphrey won it. In Ohio, Nixon. California, Nixon won it, but barely. Texas. Still not sure in Texas. In Missouri, they're still not sure. It's too close. Pennsylvania went to Humphrey. Took a long time to decide it, but it went. And Illinois for Nixon, and that did it.
The Huntley-Brinkley Report is produced by NBC News and brought to you in color by new Vicks NyQuil, the great new nighttime cold medicine. NyQuil relieves your major cold symptoms so well, it even helps you get the rest you need.
Got a cold, huh?
Oh, terrible.
Although the other campaign aides were with him, he watched until assured he had won, slept briefly, visited his family in their nearby suite, waited for word from Humphrey, and then, shortly after noon, went to the hotel ballroom where a crowd of newsmen and several hundred party workers had waited.
Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't realize so many of you would stay up so late. I want to express first my grateful appreciation to all of those in this room, but more than that, through the medium of television and radio, the thousands, and I understand millions across the country who worked for our cause. I, as you probably have heard, have received a very gracious message from the Vice President congratulating me for winning the election. I have also had a telephone conversation with him, and I thought I might share with you and also our television audience some of the thoughts that I expressed to him in that telephone conversation. I congratulated him for his gallant and courageous fight against great odds. I admire a fighter. And he proved himself to be one. He never gave up, and he gave us a good fight. I also told him that as he finished this campaign that I know exactly how he felt. I know how it feels to lose a close one. Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun. But I would like to express to him and also to the thousands that work for him, because he, like myself, had a great corps of volunteer workers, many young people as well as others, a bit of philosophy that has guided me through the years of defeat toward this victory, and it is this: a great philosophy is never won without defeat. It is always won without fear. What is important is that a man or a woman engage in the battle, be in the arena, participate. And I hope that all of those that supported Mr. Humphrey and will continue their interest in politics. They will perhaps be in the other party. We may be contesting again, who knows. But the important thing is that our process in this country works better when we have devoted, dedicated people giving their all in battle for a cause that they believe in. And I would urge particularly the young people who supported him and lost not to be discouraged, but to continue their interest and to go on to other areas of public service. I saw many signs in this campaign. Some of them were not friendly. Some were very friendly. But the one that touched me the most was one that I saw in Deshler, Ohio, at the end of a long day of whistle stopping. A little town, I suppose 5 times the population was there in the dusk. It was almost impossible to see, but a teenager held up a sign, "Bring us together." And that will be the great objective of this administration at the outset, to bring the American people together. This will be an open administration, open to new ideas, open to men and women of both parties, open to the critics as well as those who support us. We want to bridge the generation gap. We want to bridge the gap between the races. We want to bring America together. And I am confident that this task is one that we can undertake and one in which we will be successful. Now, I think all of you probably wondered how I felt about winning the election, and naturally in my press conferences I always gave the appearance of complete optimism. We were going to win. That is what you have to say. But I want all of you to know that there are moments when we have doubts. And all of us had doubts, but there was one member of our family, I learned, that had no doubts at all. Because immediately after we saw the final return this morning at 9:30 or so on television, that the Illinois votes were now considered to be in our column, my daughter Julie asked me to come into her room, that she had a present for me that she had made and worked on all the time during these trips that she was taking across the country. And when you see this present, you will see she never had any doubt at all. Here it is.
That's the president. I think that's not the presidential seal. That's actually the Great Seal of the United States. Very touching, though.
Ladies and and gentlemen, to show you how unsophisticated I am about this kind of art, when I saw it, I said, isn't that needlepoint? And she said, no, it's cruel. But it's the kindest thing that I've had happen, even though it's cruel. Thank you.
President Johnson sent Nixon a congratulatory telegram praising him for perseverance and determination and promising to help him in any way he can. The president also sent a telegram to Humphrey congratulating him on a brave, enlightened, and vigorous campaign. Nixon set out this afternoon for a few days' rest at Key Biscayne, Florida, and on the way there he planned to visit former President Eisenhower at Walter Reed Army Medical Center near Washington.
We've taken
So I've been talking, sometimes I forget to unmute my mic. I feel a little bit embarrassed, but this is what the map looked like. The states in gold that you see there are the ones that are won by Wallace. He also won a faithless elector in North Carolina, it looks like. States in red, Nixon won. States in blue, Humphrey won. And Nixon won about the same number of electoral votes that Kennedy won in 1960. And so Nixon, you know, he won the key swing states. In this case, Illinois was the one that put him over the top, but really it was Ohio, Illinois. It was Ohio, Illinois, and California that really did it for him. And so that's one of the things that make it really interesting. There are a lot of really interesting things to look at in this map and a lot of hidden messages. There's three hidden kind of takeaways from this, and they're all kind of tied to each other. This is one of those elections where Albion Seed, if you are familiar with the four kind of political, social, economic gateways into America, because the United States was really kind of founded by four different groups of settlers from the Kingdom of Great Britain. And you can kind of see that in the results on this map here. So Humphrey did well with in the states where you had, you know, kind of the really northern tier, the New England Puritans. And then Wallace did well and won states that were settled by the Virginia Cavaliers, that eventually they kind of migrated south and kind of settled the Deep South. So you have your Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas to a lesser extent. But I mean, imperfect as it is, Nixon won the election because he did well with the two middle groups of Albion Seed. He did well with the Friends migration, the people who settled the Delaware Valley and their ancestors and then went due west. And he also did well with the Appalachia, the Scots-Irish who settled the backcountry. That they're primarily in states like Kentucky, Tennessee. There are a lot of them in Missouri, Oklahoma, and they settled the Southwest, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, even Southern California to some extent. And that's where Nixon's strength was, along with what I call the Friends migration, the nation of immigrants. That's basically, and you see of all the key swing states, the three that were key to him, Ohio, Illinois, and California, they were at this time in American politics and American history, they were dominated by the descendants of the Quakers and the Friends migration. Nixon, oddly enough, was a Quaker himself. His ancestors, I think, came through Pennsylvania. So he did well in his ancestral track of the country, as well as, you know, the adjacent track of, you know, the Midland South and all its kind of derivative states and settlements. So yeah, this is one of those electoral maps. If you read very carefully, you can see those original lines, those original settlement divides, the settler divides. So, and then since 1972 was a landslide, there isn't really much to cover on election night. That's why, like in my last stream when I covered 1960, I also covered 1964. Well, just like with this election, with 1968 being close, we'll go ahead and cover 1972 because there isn't that much to cover. It was just a Nixon landslide, but I want you to see what it was like to watch it live as it happened. So we're gonna pull up NBC's coverage again, 4 years later, and the Huntley-Brinkley report had become NBC Nightly News after July of 1970 when Chet Huntley retired. And it was hosted primarily by John Chancellor and to a lesser extent by David Brinkley. And you'll see John Chancellor basically being the lead anchor on elections from 1972 through really the next three election cycles, 72, 76, and 1980.
Tuesday, November 7th. Reported by John Chancellor and David Brinkley.
And good evening to you all as we begin our coverage of the 1972 election. David Brinkley and the rest of our...
This is only a 12-minute long video, so just bear with us.
Our team are here to cover the returns in contest for 435 seats in the House of Representatives, 33 in the Senate, and 18 governorships, and of course the presidency. So let's begin with a look at the popular votes recorded so far for the presidency. With 1% of the vote in now, Mr. Nixon leading better than 2-1, just about 2-1 over George McGovern. John Schmitz, the American Party candidate, small number of votes, and Dr. Benjamin Spock of the People's Party, an even smaller number. But this pattern that you see on your screen now, 65% for the president, 34% for McGovern, although it's very early in the evening, is close to what some of the polls were showing and some of the polls were indicating in various states. We had a heavy turnout today in most of the populous states, and it looks like around the country there were many, many people who voted. It looks like a heavy turnout. In Michigan, there were long lines. In New York City and upstate, there were long lines of voters. In Illinois, the voters went through cold and often rainy weather to go to the polls in record numbers. In Ohio, they extended the hours in some polling places because of trouble with voting machines, but there was a heavy vote there, and they're talking about record numbers of voters turning out in California. Leaders of both parties today, both the Republicans and the Democrats, said that was good news to them. Senator McGovern's people said they were finding very good turnouts in places where they expected support, and so did the Republican National Chairman. NBC News has 3 winners declared so far in this election, and David Brinkley will report on them.
We will, of course, keep you up to date all night on the popular vote, as you've just seen. That is, people in voting booths. We have been able to project 3 states, the outcome in 3 states. They give Mr. Nixon 32 electoral votes. As everyone knows, but often forgets, it is electoral votes that elect somebody president. The 3 states are Tennessee, where we project that Mr. Nixon will win with 68% of the vote. Kentucky, where we project 61% for Nixon. And Indiana, 64%. That's 3 states settled so far. As everyone knows, but often forgets, it takes 270 to elect anyone president, to make you the most powerful person on earth. And so, in this country today, those are eagerly sought little nuggets. When we have 270 votes, we will have the winner. And when we do, you'll be the first to know. John?
One final note. Harry's Bar in Paris, a gathering place for expatriate Americans, held its annual straw poll today. Richard Nixon got 56% of the vote. Don't laugh. Harry's Bar has not been wrong in one of these straw polls since 1924. President and Mrs. Nixon voted today in San Clemente, California. They were
Harry's
applauded
bar
by a
has
small
been
crowd
wrong,
as they drove up to the
more
Concordia
recently.
Elementary School, 2 blocks from the Western White House. And they were the first to vote today in the school. Richard Valeriani.
That's right. The Western White House didn't start with with Bush. Reagan had one, and so did Nixon. It served as a contra saying, "I'm not an Easterner. I'm not stuffy DC Beltway politician. I'm a rough-hewn cowboy. I'm a Westerner." That's what the whole Western White House shtick is about.
Reports.
To vote at precisely 7 a.m. when the polls opened. Their voting place was the library of the Concordia Elementary School, about a half mile from the Western White House in San Clemente. The president spent more than 5 minutes in the voting booth, filling out a newspaper-sized ballot that contained 26 state and local propositions, including a referendum on legalizing marijuana. Mr. Nixon carried.
Oh man, they were pushing it even back then. Wow. Go California.
His home state in both 1960 and 1968, and he's favored to do it again, with heavily Republican Orange County supplying much of the margin. After casting his ballot, Mr. Nixon gave presidential pens to the election officials. The Nixons then flew back to Washington for a family dinner with their 2 daughters and sons-in-law at the White House, where they'll watch the election returns on television. The president is also expected to show up at a victory celebration at a Washington hotel later tonight. This event represented a landmark of sorts on the American political scene. Richard Nixon has been a rather controversial part of that scene for 26 years, and he expects to be around for 4 more years. But this was his last appearance as a candidate for public office, and someday there may be a plaque here at this school to commemorate the occasion. Richard Valeriani, NBC News, with the president in California.
This is the ballroom in Washington where the Republicans plan their big victory party, and the loud music already is underway. This is where both President Nixon and Vice President Agnew are expected later tonight. It's a party for about 5,000 people invited by the White House, by the Committee to Re-elect the President, and by the Republican National Committee. To say that people around here are confident is an understatement. The White House already has spread the word they expect to carry 48 states, with only Massachusetts and West Virginia in doubt. I've been traveling with Vice President Agnew, and last night on the airplane coming back from his final rally in Richmond, Virginia, there was a chance to chat with some of the people who will be at this party tonight. And one of them told me that weeks before, they had already ruled out any possibility of ever losing this election. So they really felt it was over before it started. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News at Republican headquarters in Washington.
For George McGovern, the long campaign for the presidency ended this morning when he and Mrs. McGovern voted in the basement of a church in his hometown in South Dakota. John Dancy has a report.
Senator McGovern voted today in the Congregational Church in his hometown of Mitchell, South Dakota. McGovern flew home to South Dakota early this morning after one last exhausting day of campaigning that took him all the way across the country, from New York to California.
We wanted to bring... You're so good to be here. Appreciate it. Yes, you never change. Good to see you.
With him as he voted this morning, as she has been throughout most of the campaign, was his wife, Eleanor. McGovern voted a straight Democratic ticket, said he thought he'd made a wise choice. He spent part of the day talking to students at his alma mater, Dakota Wesleyan University, before returning to Sioux Falls to watch the results come in.
This is where 22 months of campaigning will end for George McGovern, underneath this rainbow in the Municipal Coliseum in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It's here that later this evening McGovern will come to make either his victory or concession statement. At this point, most people are speculating it will be a concession statement because the McGovern campaign, by its own admission, is in real trouble. Throughout the campaign, the McGovern forces have concentrated their efforts in a dozen or so states and more or less conceded the rest of the country to the Republicans. Here's their assessment of how they're doing in those dozen states or so. They think they have a good chance in California, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, South Dakota, the District of Columbia, and surprisingly Arkansas, where party leaders are working hard for the ticket. They list as questionable big states like Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and Texas, and they say they have some real problems in New York and Pennsylvania. So it's not too hopeful a picture. 4 of the must-win states are now listed as questionable, and 2 of them are doubtful. But whatever the outcome, McGovern feels he has run a good race, he's done everything possible to win, and now tonight he waits to see if it was enough. John Dancy, NBC News, at McGovern headquarters in Sioux Falls, South Dakota.
Sergeant Shriver cast his ballot in Rockville, Maryland, the Washington suburb where he lives, and Spiro Agnew voted at his hometown in suburban Baltimore. Ron Nesson reports on both candidates.
Agnew and his wife voted at an elementary school in Towson, Maryland. Towson, in Baltimore County, is the Agnew's legal residence, and it's where Agnew got his start in politics when he was elected county executive 10 years ago. Agnew jokingly declined to confirm that he voted Republican, and he would not predict how the election will come out, but he did tell one reason why he thinks the polls show McGovern far behind.
Different things, different issues affected different areas, and certainly the idea that McGovern was criticizing the foreign policy of the country, which has never been done, I think hurt him very badly.
Agnew will follow the returns tonight at Republican election headquarters in Washington. Shriver and his wife voted at a high school near their rented estate in Rockville, Maryland, a suburb of Washington. The Shrivers did not return home from the last campaign stops in Texas until 5 a.m., so they slept late and did not get to the polls until mid-afternoon. They voted the straight Democratic ticket. Shriver complained that the real issues were not discussed enough in the campaign, and the polls were discussed too much.
I'd like to continue to discuss the issues, because I don't think the issues really ever got discussed enough.
He's crying over spilt milk.
Never really did. Why was that? It seems to me that I...
Wah. Nobody likes somebody like him.
More time talking about whether the polls were right or wrong, and whether unemployment was up or down, or whether it could go up lower, or whether war and peace was to handle it right. Nearly all the time it was a question of the polls.
Shriver will make his concession or victory statement at Democratic election headquarters in Washington. Ron Nesson, NBC News, Rockville, Maryland.
Senator McGovern said today that the Columbia Broadcasting System may not broadcast from his election night headquarters in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Technicians at CBS have been on strike there for 4 days. Earlier, the network said it would confine its on-the-spot coverage to the 2 major presidential candidates, but now McGovern has said, as far as he's concerned, the answer is no. It will be hours.
Wow, not even CBS, not even CBS wanted to support him. Technicians.
Before all the polls everywhere are closed, but some more of the votes are in, and we'll have a look at them in just a moment.
Now, this is just absolutely fucking amazing. You just don't have elections like this anymore that are called so early, like literally an hour after the first polls close. This, you would... I don't know that we'll ever hear a call this early or anything like this in our lifetime. But although I do kind of think landslides are going to become common once again, we're gonna enter an era where we are going to get away from close elections, probably in the 2030s or 2040s. So, but we'll see. This is just like it's almost like going into another dimension or something like that. But watch, enjoy this.
Good evening again. We've been looking at some of the returns from our specially chosen precincts that will tell us how different kinds of voters are voting. It is now clear that Richard Nixon is the winner of this election. If what we have learned so far from the votes already cast continues to happen as the polls close across the country, the president will be reelected in a landslide. That's what our trend now indicates. The president re-elected by a landslide.
I kind of love the the eye catches or the intros and outros that you get from this era, like the 1970s. That's just so cool. Yeah, Return. You know, it's one of those things. I don't know. I love it. I love shit from this era. Okay, so obviously, you know, they had mentioned the Nixon campaign thought the only two states in doubt were Massachusetts and West Virginia, and they were pretty much right. The only ones, they were almost right on the button. This was the map. Nixon won 49 of the 50 states. The only one he lost was Massachusetts. He did win West Virginia. He did get one faithless elector in Virginia, though, but he won 520 electoral votes. And this is also some interesting tidbits here. This is the last time a Republican presidential candidate won Minnesota. The two closest times I think anybody has come since then was Ronald Reagan in 1984. He lost Minnesota by like 4,000 votes, something like that. And Donald Trump in 2016, he lost Minnesota by, I think, 60,000 votes. He got I think he lost it by only a couple of points. Minnesota is odd. Minnesota is just one of those things where I kind of feel, and this is my unbiased political opinion, it's like Republicans could probably win that state if they actually believed they could win that state. It's to Republicans kind of like what maybe Texas is to Democrats. I'm not sure if that's kind of an apt comparison, but if you actually look back at recent election cycles, in most statewide elections and in presidential elections until recently, Minnesota actually in a lot of cycles votes to the right of Michigan, and Michigan's considered a swing state and has voted Republican 2 of the last 3 elections for president. If you don't believe me, go back and look. George Bush back in 2000, 2004, he only lost Minnesota, I think, by like 3 or 4 points in both of those elections. He did better in Minnesota than he did in Michigan in those 2, if I remember correctly. And I want to say maybe Mitt Romney lost Minnesota by a smaller margin than he lost Michigan as well, but don't quote me on that. I'd have to go look it up. It's been a while since I looked up the election results, but yeah, and I think Minnesota has more recently had a Republican senator than Michigan has had. I don't think Michigan's elected a Republican to the Senate since the 1990s. But anyway, yeah, this is what the map looked like. This was the first election also where California was worth more electoral votes than New York, because California became the largest state in population in 1970. This is one of only 2 times that Hawaii's voted for the Republican candidate. Reagan also won it in 84. But this, in many ways, even though I think Reagan won 525 electoral votes, and that's only because Minnesota is worth less electoral votes than Massachusetts, except for that measure, this was a bigger landslide than 1984, even though 1984 is the one that Republicans like to talk about, oh, Reagan landslide or whatever. They forget about this one, probably because Nixon had to resign from office about a year and a half after this election. So, but just to give you how much of a landslide this was, this election, I think, has the largest margin of the popular vote to date. Nixon won by over, I think, 20 million votes. And Reagan didn't beat him in 84 on that margin. And no candidate, even with the increased number of voters and the voting population since then, nobody's won anywhere close to by close to 20 million. That's how lopsided this election was. This is also like the one of the last. This is the last election, I think, where like Richard Nixon as a Republican, he won Cook County, Illinois, which is Chicago. You don't believe me? Go look it up. He also won Fulton County, Georgia, which is where Atlanta is. Fulton County has not voted for a Democrat since then. He won Queens County, New York, the borough of Queens. He's the only Republican presidential candidate to win it, I think, since World War II. Eisenhower may have won it once or twice. I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. And he came within, I think, 5 points of winning Brooklyn. That is how lopsided. I mean, like, Democrats in this election were almost ashamed of voting for McGovern. It also didn't help, and something that really wasn't mentioned, obviously, because the news probably didn't want to cover it, was McGovern, I think, proposed a 100% estate tax above like a certain amount, and that was just really unpopular among like the entire electorate as a whole, almost, especially farmers, and that didn't really help him. There were just a lot of blunders that the Democratic campaign, the McGovern campaign, made in this election. And you can say, hindsight being 2020, like Watergate brought Nixon down, and why did they break into the hotel or whatever, when obviously Nixon should have known he had the election in the bag 6 months out. Well, who knows what was going through his mind. Richard Nixon died in 1994, I think. So, but yeah, this was just an absolute wallop of an election. We're probably never going to see something like this again. This is one of only, I think, this is basically almost the inverse of what 1964 was like, where LBJ won almost 500 electoral votes, and almost the entire map was blue. There were elections like this were a lot. I won't say a lot, but I mean they were not unheard of back in this era. FDR in 1936 won all 48 states at the time except Maine and Vermont. He won like 523, I think, electoral votes or something like that. And then Reagan in 84 won 49 states as well with 525 electoral votes. We'll get to that election eventually when I cover 1980, most likely. I may cover 1980 and 1984 separately. We'll see. But that's gonna do it. That's gonna wrap it up for this stream. Thank you all for watching. Thanks for all the input and all the commentary. It looks like YouTube censored some of the comments, which I don't necessarily mind. I'd like to keep my stream somewhat clean. So, but once again, thanks for watching. This lasted a little bit longer than I was expecting, but I think we all had a good time. And to any of you who are going to FaceCon, I may see you there, because I will be catching a flight tomorrow evening out there. So super excited about it. I get to go to another VTuber convention, the first one since OffCai last year, and I'm going to OffCai as well. So, but I'm not going to hit the hay probably for another hour, but I need to start getting ready for packing, because I've got to, I still have to work for a little bit tomorrow before I get dropped off at the airport. So, but once again, thanks for watching. We'll do more of these. I'm gonna do maybe some more gun related content. I keep I originally founded this channel to do like driving videos and whatever. I keep getting further away from that because I just love shit like this. I don't know why, but But thanks to all of you, and y'all have a good night and a great weekend.